kids and the neighborhood children spent countless summers playing, climbing its sturdy branches. It was also where we gathered with friends and family for weekend barbecues filled with laughter. The oak became deeply rooted in our memories, an inseparable part of our family. Our house was one of the first built here, predating the development of the rest of the neighborhood and the formation of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association in the late 80s. When we bought the house from my parents, we were assured that older properties like ours, with their unique characteristics, would always have their existing rights respected, not mechanically forced into new regulations. And indeed, for many years, we lived harmoniously within the community. The oak even became a beloved neighborhood landmark. In the fall, when its leaves turned a brilliant amber yellow, more than a few passers-by would stop to take pictures, marveling at its beauty. We were always proud of our home and yard, striving to keep it clean and tidy, contributing our small part to the overall peaceful beauty of Willow Creek. The fragile peace at Willow Creek Estates, where my family had lived for 3 generations, began to crack and shatter the day Eleanor Vance was elected HOA president. She blew in like a cold wind from the city, a retired investment fund manager with perfectly coiffed platinum hair, expensive business attire even on weekend strolls, and a condescending attitude that judged everything not to her liking. She arrived with a vision, a word she frequently used in her initial HOA newsletters for a perfect and uniform Willow Creek. That uniformity, by her interpretation, seemed to mean eliminating anything with personal character or history, anything that didn't conform to the rigid, modern aesthetic mold she envisioned. It didn't take long for that vision to target the proudest, most steadfast symbol in our front yard, the century-old oak tree planted by my grandfather upon his return from war, a gentle giant that had witnessed the Miller family's life unfold. It became something unsuitable, an anomaly in the perfect picture Mrs. Vance wanted to paint. It began subtly, almost harmlessly. The first official letter arrived in a thick cream envelope bearing the embossed HOA logo. Its tone was deceptively polite, expressing mild concern that leaves from our oak might potentially blow into the community pool area. The possibility, I calculated, was near zero. The pool was at the far end of a winding road, at least 100 yards away as the crow flies, not to mention the houses and other trees standing between us. Furthermore, the pool area had been upgraded just last year, boasting a state-of-the-art circulating filtration system designed to handle all sorts of debris, from leaves to sunscreen. I read the letter several times, feeling more annoyed than worried. Surely, this was just a misunderstanding, some overzealous bureaucracy from the new president wanting to appear diligent. I carefully drafted an equally polite reply, detailing the geographical distance, the prevailing wind direction which typically blew the opposite way, and the proven effectiveness of the pool's filter system. I even attached a printout from Google Maps to illustrate the distance. I sent it off, confident this minor issue was reasonably resolved. That confidence quickly evaporated when the second letter arrived just 2 weeks later. The envelope was still cream, but the tone inside had shed its polite veneer, replaced by stiffness and demand. It claimed that some residents, pointedly unnamed, had formally complained about our oak leaves affecting their enjoyment experience at the pool. It was ludicrous. No one had ever said a word to me about the tree, except to compliment its beauty. The letter demanded we take immediate corrective measures to address the leaf problem. The wording was vague, but the implication was clear: severe pruning, or worse, complete removal. More ominously, a closing line warned of fines if we failed to comply within 15 days. Now I knew it wasn't a misunderstanding. A vague unease began to creep in. Something felt off, something more personal hidden behind this excuse about leaves and the pool. I decided direct dialogue was the best approach. Perhaps if Mrs. Vance saw the tree up close, understood its history, felt its steadfastness and beauty, she'd realize the absurdity of the request. I sent a polite email, inviting her and any other board members she wished to bring to our home one weekend afternoon to discuss the matter and view the tree together. She agreed tersely. That meeting was a disaster thinly veiled by social niceties. Vance arrived not alone, but with 2 other board members, clearly her close allies, who nodded along to everything she said. Instead of an open conversation, it felt like a judgmental inspection. Vance, in a flawless beige pantsuit, circled the base of the oak with a pinched expression, lips tight. She didn't look up at the majestic canopy or touch the time-worn, rough bark. Instead, she pointed at the highest branches, muttering about potential liability if a limb breaks, and the unsightliness of fall leaves creating clutter. When I tried again to explain the distance to the pool and the filter system, she waved it away impatiently. "Mr. Miller, we need to maintain standards," she stated, her voice flat but cold, the smile never reaching her icy blue eyes. "The fact is, this tree is simply too large. It no longer fits the modern, carefully planned landscape of Willow Creek. Its leaves, wherever they fall, are an issue. It creates messiness." Not another word about the pool. It was obvious that was just the initial pretext. The real target was the tree itself. The meeting ended with a heavy sense of defeat and an implicit warning that she wouldn't back down. Soon after, as expected, the paper assault began systematically. Official violation notices arrived like clockwork every Monday morning, sitting prominently atop the mail pile. Each notice listed a $50 fine for every day we failed to control leaf fall and failed to comply with the corrective action request. The total climbed rapidly, $50, then $350 after a week, then $700. It was a form of psychological torture by paperwork, constant and blatant harassment. My wife, Sarah, began to seriously worry. "David, they aren't going to stop," she said, her voice tight with stress as she looked at the latest fine notice. "This amount is getting huge. They could put a lien on the house." Her fear wasn't unfounded. HOAs wield frightening power in enforcing their rules, however unreasonable they might seem. We knew we couldn't fight this alone anymore. It was time for legal help. We turned to Maria Flores, a family lawyer we'd known and trusted for years. Maria listened intently to our story, reviewing the letters, violation notices, and a copy of the Willow Creek HOA bylaws and candars. After careful study, she confirmed what we suspected: the leaves in the pool justification was incredibly weak and almost certainly wouldn't hold up in court. The distance was too great, the filter system too effective, and there was no concrete evidence our leaves were actually causing a problem. However, she also delivered a dose of reality. "HOA battles are tricky," Maria explained, leaning back in her chair. "They have the resources from all the members' dues, and they can be very persistent. Even if the initial reason is weak, they might try to find other minor violations to apply pressure. Mrs. Vance sounds very determined and unafraid to use her authority. This could be a long, expensive, and emotionally draining fight." Despite the warning, we decided we had to push back. Maria drafted a strong, formal response letter to the HOA board. It refuted all allegations concerning the oak, pointed out the absurdity of the pool excuse, demanded an immediate cessation of the baseless violation notices and fines, and stated that any further action targeting the oak or the Miller family without solid legal grounds would be considered harassment, for which we would seek all available legal remedies. The letter was sent via certified mail, lawyer's signature prominent. Sending the legal letter brought a brief pause. The weekly fine notices abruptly stopped. For a few weeks, it seemed the storm might have passed. But deep down, we knew this was likely just a lull before another, more intense assault. Tension still hung heavy in our house, palpable every time we looked out at the oak. We could almost feel Vance's eyes watching from her large house on the hill, knowing she wouldn't easily abandon the fight she had started. The oak still stood, majestic and resilient, but its fate, and our peace, now felt more fragile than ever. The fragile calm brought by Maria Flores's letter didn't last long. It was like the unnatural stillness before a violent thunderstorm, a heavy quiet that made the air in our house thick with anticipation of the next blow. And it came, not as another fine notice, but as an official announcement delivered to every household in Willow Creek. A special HOA meeting had been called, with the sole agenda item stated clearly as discussion and vote on the Miller property oak tree issue concerning community rules and aesthetics. My stomach tightened as I read the cold words. This was it. Eleanor Vance was escalating the fight to a new level, making it public and official. She was no longer hiding behind anonymous complaints or vague pool excuses. Now, she intended to mobilize the collective, albeit coerced, power of the HOA to achieve her goal. The evening of the meeting, the air in the community clubhouse was thick with tension and curiosity. Many familiar faces, neighbors we'd exchanged pleasantries with, now watched us with scrutinizing or averted gazes. A few offered sympathetic looks, but the majority seemed either eager for drama or, worse, already swayed by Vance's narrative. She stood at the small podium at the front, poised and confident, holding a folder of documents. Beside her sat her two loyal allies on the board, nodding in agreement. Vance began her address with platitudes about the shared responsibility of maintaining the value and beauty of Willow Creek. Then she pivoted, her tone growing serious, speaking of growing concerns regarding our oak. She held up a few color printouts showing dry leaves on a sidewalk or patch of grass somewhere, nothing proving they were from our tree, nor depicting any significant mess. She glossed over these quickly, as if they were irrefutable proof. But then she played her new card, an entirely different justification than before. More importantly, she emphasized, her voice laced with feigned concern, we have reason to believe the root system of this mature tree could pose a potential hazard to public infrastructure, specifically the sidewalk running along the property line. She offered no evidence of actual root damage, no photos of cracked sidewalks, no reports from engineers or arborists. Just a vague assertion of potential and hazard. I tried to stand and speak, wanting to point out the absurdity, to reiterate our offer for an expert evaluation, to speak of the tree's history. But Vance quickly cut me off. Mr. Miller, we appreciate your input, but this isn't the time for personal debate. We need to make a decision for the common good of the community. She signaled a board member to read the pre-written resolution. It mandated that the Miller family, at our own expense, completely remove the oak tree within 30 days of notification. If we failed to comply, the HOA reserved the right to hire a tree service to perform the removal, and the entire cost, plus all previously documented fines, despite our objections, would be billed to our account. And the worst part, the resolution explicitly stated the HOA would place a lien on our home until the full amount was paid. The vote was swift. Vance and her two allies raised their hands immediately. A few other hands went up hesitantly, perhaps persuaded by the talk of responsibility and potential hazards, or simply unwilling to cross the powerful precedent. A small number voted against or abstained, but it wasn't enough. The resolution passed. A copy was handed to me right there at the meeting, as cold and final as a sentence. This was no longer about petty threats or harassment. This was a direct assault, using the full, albeit distorted, legal power of the HOA to take away a piece of our property, a piece of our family history. Helplessness and rage surged within me. We left the meeting room in heavy silence, feeling the curious and pitying, or perhaps smug, eyes follow us out. The very next day, we met with Maria Flores again. She read the resolution carefully, her expression grim. They're playing hardball, David, she said. The root argument is still weak without concrete proof, but the fact they've officially passed the resolution complicates things. They're banking on the collective authority to force your hand. Maria tried one more time. She sent a letter to the board formally proposing specific alternatives, hiring an independent, mutually agreed upon arborist to assess the root system and any actual risk, or offering for us to pay for the installation of a professional root barrier along the sidewalk, a common engineering solution to prevent problematic root growth. These were reasonable proposals, showing good faith to address their concern, without destroying the tree. But every offer was flatly rejected by the HOA board, clearly acting under Vance's unwavering direction. Their response was brief and cold. The resolution has been passed. Removal is the only acceptable solution. Left with no other option, we resorted to our last recourse, filing an appeal with the county's mediation committee, a body set up to resolve HOA disputes before they reach court. We hoped an objective third party would see the unreasonableness and injustice of the HOA's actions. Maria meticulously prepared the file, presenting all evidence, correspondence, rejected proposals, and emphasizing the lack of basis for the HOA's justifications. But that faint hope was quickly extinguished. When we received notice of the hearing schedule and the committee's composition, Maria recognized the name of the presiding officer. It was a retired judge known to be Eleanor Vance's regular, close bridge partner. A damning coincidence. The hearing went exactly as we feared. It was astonishingly brief. The presiding officer seemed impatient as Maria presented our case, frequently interrupting and focusing solely on whether the HOA had followed the procedural steps for the vote, not on the merits or fairness of the resolution itself. The HOA's lawyer, conversely, was heard attentively. The ruling came almost immediately after presentations concluded. The committee upheld the HOA's decision. No detailed explanation, no consideration of historical or sentimental factors. Just a cold rubber stamp on the HOA's action. The final door seemed to slam shut. We faced a grim choice, a dead end. Either we hire someone ourselves to cut down our beloved family symbol within the remaining deadline of less than 2 weeks. Or we resist, let the HOA hire someone, and then face a potentially ruinous bill covering the removal and the accumulated bogus fines, ultimately risking losing our home to the lien they threatened to impose. The legal costs of appealing further to a higher court were substantial, and the outcome uncertain, especially against an organization with the HOA's resources. My heart felt like it was breaking. The final decision was made through tears and desperation. Sarah sobbed as I picked up the phone, my voice trembling, to call Arborvale Tree Service, a reputable company we found online, fully equipped for large, mature trees. Scheduling the removal felt like arranging the execution date for a loved one. The following Tuesday. That day was circled in red on our wall calendar, a tragic marker of our powerlessness. Helplessness enveloped our family during those waiting days. The house fell into a heavy silence. We walked past the oak, trying not to look too long, yet unable to pull our eyes away. We touched its rough, gnarled bark, trying to commit every detail, every grain, every scar of time to memory. Its lush green canopy still rustled in the breeze, still sheltering our home as it had for decades, unaware of the grim fate awaiting it. The hardest part was explaining it to the kids. My 10-year-old son and 8-year-old daughter loved that tree. They grew up with it, climbing its lower branches, playing hide-and-seek behind its massive trunk, collecting acorns in the fall. How do you explain why the healthy, strong tree they cherished had to disappear? How do you talk about pettiness, abuse of power, and injustice that even we adults found hard to swallow? We could only say there were rules we had to follow, even when we didn't want to, a weak, unsatisfactory explanation that left them confused and sad. On the final Sunday evening before the scheduled day, our family sat quietly under the oak. No one said much. We just watched the last rays of sunlight filter through the leaves, dappling the grass. Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder, crying softly. The kids sat against the trunk, drawing aimless shapes in the dirt with twigs. It was a wordless farewell, filled with grief and regret for our century-old family friend, a silent but ever-present member. The feeling of betrayal by the very community we'd always tried to live peacefully in and contribute to seeped into our bones. We'd followed every other rule, maintained our property, paid our HOA dues, but because one tree offended the new president, none of that mattered. Helplessness and pain pressed down on my chest, signaling an irreplaceable loss about to occur. In the long, heavy days dragging on before the chainsaws would silence the oak, a strange urge grew inside me. It wasn't exactly hope. Every door seemed slammed shut, but more like a need to connect with the past, with my grandfather's legacy, the man who planted this tree with his own hands. Part of me wanted to search, however desperately, for any overlooked legal loophole, some detail Maria might have missed in the HOA's tangled regulations. Another, perhaps larger part, simply sought solace in old keepsakes, touching the yellowed papers marked by time, as a way to say goodbye not just to the tree but to a piece of family history. So, one gloomy late afternoon, I dragged the old dusty metal box full of papers down from the attic, blew off the thick layer of dust, and started spreading them across the living room floor. There was everything: original house blueprints detailed down to the nails, the ink faded but clear, the original property deed with its wax seal and flourished notary signature from decades ago, old repair invoices, property tax receipts from years when its value was a fraction of today's. I flipped through each page, not really looking for anything specific, just letting the memories flow. I pictured my grandfather, a man of few words but sturdy resolve, examining these plans, maybe hammering in roof beams himself. I saw my father carefully preserving these documents, telling me the importance of keeping records. It was a journey back in time, a sad connection to the previous generations who had lived in and loved this house, under the shade of the very tree about to be felled. And then, amidst a stack of plot plans and permits for auxiliary buildings, I saw it. A large, hand-drawn cadastral survey map on yellow parchment paper, dated 1956. It was older than most of the other documents, created before much of Willow Creek was planned and developed into the modern subdivision it was now. The map detailed our lot and a few sparse surrounding parcels, with meticulous India ink lines noting elevations, boundaries, and a few natural features. I almost glossed over it, but a faint, easily missed line running diagonally across the corner of our front yard, right where the ancient oak stood, caught my eye. The line was labeled with small, slightly faded handwriting. Private sewer easement. My heart beat a little faster. Private sewer easement? That was odd. The city sewer main ran along the street out front, and our house line connected directly to it, like every other house on the block. I looked closer at the map. This mysterious pipe didn't connect to the public system at all. It originated somewhere on the higher ground behind our property, ran underground across a corner of our lot, and seemed to terminate somewhere further downhill, off the map's edge. Crucially, the point where it crossed our land was exactly beneath where the oak's massive root system had anchored itself over the decades. I sat stunned for a moment, putting the pieces together. The higher ground behind our house, that's where the larger, newer homes were built later, including the stately mansion belonging to Eleanor Vance and the homes of her two key board member allies, the ones who had voted most enthusiastically for the oak's removal. An idea sparked in my mind, blazing like lightning in the desperate darkness. Could it be? Could the real reason they wanted the tree gone have nothing to do with leaves dirtying a pool or roots potentially damaging a public sidewalk? Could it be that the oak's deep, powerful roots were threatening their secret, illegal sewer line? Did Vance need the tree gone to inspect, repair, or even replace her line without revealing its illicit existence? Or perhaps she feared the roots had already compromised it? It was the perfect cover: force the tree's removal under the HOA's authority, then discover the pipe during the stump excavation and fix it quietly. A plan began to form. We had to let the removal happen, but we could ensure our property rights were asserted when that pipe was inevitably unearthed. I called Maria immediately. She checked the county records again. Absolutely no record of any easement granted or permit issued for a private sewer line crossing our property. It was definitely unauthorized, an illegal encroachment. Then I made another call, this one to Gus, the foreman at Arborvale Tree Service. I explained the situation discreetly, offering a significant cash bonus, call it hazard pay for unexpected underground obstructions. The plan was set: let them cut down the tree. When they dug out the stump, they would discover the pipe. I would be ready with the map and the county confirmation of its legality. I would then formally demand they remove the trespassing section of pipe from my property as part of the HOA-mandated work they were already performing. We would turn their own weapon back on them, using the forced removal they demanded to legally sever their illegal connection. It was a calculated gamble, a way to turn victimhood into a trap. A feeling of grim determination began to replace the crushing helplessness. That fateful Tuesday arrived under a heavy gray sky, a perfect reflection of the gloom shrouding our home. The air was thick, humid, and the neighborhood silence felt ominous. Then, the familiar, haunting roar of a diesel engine shattered the quiet. The large white truck from Arborvale Tree Service rolled slowly down the street and parked in front of our yard, its sheer size seeming to consume the space. Doors opened, and the crew in green uniforms emerged, carrying ropes, harnesses, and gleaming chainsaws that looked like instruments ready for an execution. My heart clenched. Beside me, Sarah gripped my hand, her fingers ice cold. I could feel a slight tremor run through her. Through the living room window, I saw the small figures of our children, their faces pressed against the glass, watching with wide, confused, and sad eyes. We tried to explain, but how could their young minds grasp the cruel complexities of the adult world, where a living tree could be condemned simply because someone didn't like it? The crew began their work with methodical, detached efficiency. The thud of ropes being tossed, the clang of metal hooks, and then, the most dreadful sound, the chainsaw roaring to life, a piercing screech that tore through the quiet air. It sounded like a cry of pain, a desperate protest from the gentle giant under assault. Each bite of the saw cut deep into the rough bark, sawdust flying like wooden tears. The first major limb cracked loudly, followed by the rustle of leaves as it plunged through the air and hit the lawn with a heavy thud. Then the second, the third. The ancient oak, the pride of generations of millers, was being ruthlessly dismembered before our eyes. Neighbors began to gather across the street, a small, silent audience. There were sympathetic glances, discreet headshakes from older residents who knew our family well. There were curious eyes, taking in every detail of the unfolding drama. And I caught a few smug smiles, approving nods from those who sided with Vance, who saw the tree as a messy nuisance needing removal. Further up the hill, standing framed in the large picture window of her imposing house, was Eleanor Vance. Dressed in an elegant cream outfit, arms crossed, her face showed no emotion beyond a cold satisfaction, like she was observing the final outcome of a meticulously planned operation. She didn't even bother to come down for a closer look, just stood there like a queen overseeing the execution she had ordered. Sarah let out a soft sob beside me, the tears finally spilling over, tracing paths down her cheeks. I put my arm around her shoulder, pulling her closer, and whispered, low enough for only her to hear over the chainsaw's din. Just wait, honey. It's not over yet. Her eyes met mine, surprised and questioning, but the grief was too raw for her to process anything else. The work continued through the morning. The crew was relentless, professional, efficient. The lush green canopy gradually disappeared, revealing the stark skeleton of major branches. Finally, only the massive trunk remained, standing solitary in the ravaged yard. Then it was its turn. The chainsaw screamed louder, biting deep into the solid, centuries-old wood. There was a moment of breathless silence as the trunk began to lean, then it fell in a slow, agonizingly majestic arc, ending with a ground-shaking thud. Dirt and debris flew up. When the dust settled, all that remained of the mighty oak was a large, flat stump, like an open wound on the earth. After hours of intense labor, the crew took a lunch break. The space fell temporarily quiet, but the silence felt heavier than the noise. Our front yard looked jarringly empty, alien. The loss was brutally tangible. Gus, the crew foreman, a burly middle-aged man with whom I'd had my discreet conversation the day before, sweetened by a significant cash payment for unexpected underground obstruction removal, approached me and gave a subtle nod. He understood his unofficial task. After lunch, Gus directed a small excavator, the kind they bring for large stump removals, onto the front yard. He announced loudly enough for the curious neighbors still lingering to hear. All right, now we'll dig this stump out and level the area as required by the work order. The machine's gleaming metal bucket began its work, biting deep into the soil around the stump. Dirt and rocks flew. The machine groaned, straining against the dense, tenacious root system of the ancient tree. And then, exactly as scripted, the bucket stopped abruptly with a harsh metallic clang against something solid buried deep below. Gus hopped down from the cab, walked over to the half-dug hole, feigning inspection. He bent down, brushing away loose soil and debris. Well, look at this, folks! He called out, his surprise perfectly feigned. There's an old pipe running right here, right under the stump. Looks pretty old. Doesn't seem to be current water or gas. That was my cue. Taking a deep breath to steady myself, I stepped forward, clutching the prepared folder, the copy of the old 1956 survey map and the official letter from the County Public Works Department confirming its status. That's right, Gus, I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline. That's a pipe with no record on any county utility maps. And more importantly, there is no recorded easement allowing it to cross my property. Since your crew is already excavating here, please remove this trespassing section of pipe from my land. Cut it right at my property line. My words landed like a delayed action bomb in the silence. A murmur went through the neighbors. And right on cue, as if alerted, Eleanor Vance came hurrying down from her house, her face flushed with anger and, perhaps, panic. Her two bored allies trailed behind her. What in God's name do you think you're doing? She shrieked, her voice shrill with fury, pointing a trembling finger at the hole where the pipe lay exposed. Stop this! Stop it right now! That's our pipe! You have no right to touch it! The mask finally dropped. Gone was the veneer of polite society, the talk of aesthetics and public safety. All that remained was the raw panic of exposure. I faced her, feeling the weight of every eye upon us. I calmly held up the documents. Mrs. Vance, I said, my voice clear and firm, cutting through the neighbors' whispers. This is the original survey map, and this is confirmation from the county. This pipe has no legal right to be on my property. I am exercising my right as a property owner to have an unauthorized structure removed from my land, during the course of work mandated and approved by your HOA to remove the tree stump. This pipe ends here, at my property line. Vance sputtered, trying to argue, but her words became incoherent against the clear evidence in my hands. She turned to Gus, ordering him to stop. Gus looked at me, then at the furious Vance, then at the captivated crowd. He gave an almost imperceptible shrug, a gesture of feigned helplessness that perfectly followed the script we'd arranged. He turned back and signaled to another worker who stood ready with a specialized saw equipped with a diamond blade. The worker stepped down into the hole. A high-pitched whine screamed through the air as the blade bit into the old, soil-encrusted clay pipe. The sound was sharp, decisive, like the final stroke of a sword. Within seconds, the pipe was cleanly severed. Another worker quickly applied cement and a specialized cap, sealing the cut end firmly at the edge of my property line, ensuring nothing could pass through. Then, The excavator bucket carefully hooked the newly severed section of pipe lying on my land, a length of several feet, looking ancient and stained, lifted it clear, and dumped it unceremoniously into the large debris container on the back of the truck, mixing it with the shattered remains of the oak stump. Eleanor Vance stood frozen, as if turned to stone. All color drained from her face, leaving it a pasty, ashen white. Her eyes were wide, staring first at the sealed, severed pipe end, then at the liberated section lying among the tree debris in the truck. The cold satisfaction she displayed earlier was utterly gone, replaced by dawning horror and the sickening realization of the consequences of her own actions. She trembled, one hand flying up to cover her mouth, but no words came out. In that moment, standing on the ravaged ground where the oak had stood, she finally understood what had truly just happened. The oak was gone, but the price for its removal was only now beginning to be exacted. As the last Armadale truck disappeared down the street, leaving my front yard a disturbingly flat, empty patch of dirt, a tense silence fell over the neighborhood. The curious crowd of neighbors gradually dispersed, taking with them hushed whispers and meaningful glances toward my house and toward Vance's mansion on the hill. She and her two allies had retreated hastily back to their homes immediately after the pipe was cut, their faces masks of panic and fury. The quiet lasted perhaps an hour, an unnerving artificial peace. Then, the first sound to break the silence wasn't birdsong or children playing, but a piercing, furious scream echoing down from the direction of Vance's house. Soon after, similar shouts, mingled with the faint sounds of cursing and something crashing, erupted from the homes of the other two board members. The inevitable consequence of the severed secret sewer line had begun. Sewage from their toilets had nowhere to go but back up. Wastewater from sinks, washing machines, and showers found no outlet, quickly overwhelming and clogging their internal plumbing. Their separate, aging septic systems, entirely dependent on the illegal pipe running across my land for disposal, were now utterly paralyzed. A foul, unmistakable stench began to emanate from around their luxurious homes. My phone started ringing off the hook. First, it was curious neighbors, feigning concern but clearly fishing for details about the bizarre pipe incident. I kept my answers vague, stating only that we'd discovered and removed an old, unidentified pipe on our property during the stump removal. Then came the calls we'd anticipated. Vance's voice, shrill and threatening, demanding we take responsibility and fix this immediately, threatening lawsuits for destruction of property. I kept my voice as calm as possible, repeating firmly, "Mrs. Vance, I simply had an unlicensed, trespassing pipe removed from my private property. Perhaps you should call a professional plumber to inspect and repair your home's private drainage system." Similar threatening calls came from the other two, and my response remained the same. News of the simultaneous sewer blockage, occurring only at the homes of the HOA president and her closest allies immediately after they forced the Millers to remove their historic oak, spread like wildfire through Willow Creek. People weren't stupid. They quickly connected the dots. The real reason behind the war against the oak was now brutally obvious. It wasn't leaves, it wasn't the sidewalk. It was about protecting an illegal private sewer line. Community outrage, which had simmered beneath the surface, now boiled over, no longer directed at my family. Instead, it focused squarely on Vance and her board cohorts. Questions flew in neighborhood chat groups and over fences. Why were their HOA dues being used to fund a personal vendetta based on fabricated reasons, solely to protect the private interests and conceal the wrongdoing of a few powerful individuals? An emergency HOA meeting was hastily called that evening by the other board members, the ones unaffected by the sewage backup. The atmosphere in the room was drastically different from the last meeting. The silence and deference were gone, replaced by open anger and pointed questions. Residents who had previously stayed quiet now boldly stood up, demanding Vance explain the secret pipe, the misuse of HOA funds, the abuse of power, and the blatant lack of transparency. Vance and her two allies, looking ashen-faced and likely still haunted by the stench at their homes, offered weak defenses that only fueled the crowd's anger. The very people affected by the cut pipe, themselves, then had the gall to demand the HOA bear the cost of their emergency plumbing repairs, a request resoundingly rejected by the majority of residents. Amidst the chaos, calls for Vance's immediate resignation grew louder and more insistent. The next day, Maria Flores received a formal threatening letter from a large law firm representing Vance, but she just laughed when she read it. "They have no solid legal ground to stand on, David," she told me over the phone. You acted entirely within your rights on your own property to remove an illegal encroachment. They were the ones violating your property rights for years. Let them sue if they want. We have all the evidence we need to defend." That evening, Sarah and I sat quietly in the living room, looking out at the empty yard where the oak had proudly stood. The sadness of the loss remained, an irreplaceable void in our hearts. But mingled with the grief was a strange sense of relief, a feeling that justice, however delayed and ironically delivered, had finally been served. We hadn't sought revenge, but circumstances themselves had orchestrated an unexpected reckoning for arrogance and deceit. The fallout from the severed secret sewer line was swift and unforgiving for Eleanor Vance and her two allies. Faced with completely paralyzed plumbing and an increasingly unbearable stench enveloping their expensive homes, they had no choice but to take emergency action. The fix wasn't as simple as reconnecting the old pipe. Their years of illegal usage were now exposed. They were forced to do what they should have done years ago: connect to the city's public sewer system. This meant hiring professional contractors, navigating complex county permits, and most significantly, footing an enormous bill for entirely new sewer lines to be trenched and installed along a different, legitimate route. The costs ran into the tens of thousands of dollars for each household, a substantial financial blow even for affluent residents like them. But perhaps worse than the monetary cost was the utter public humiliation throughout Willow Creek. They became the subject of neighborhood gossip and jokes about the sewer blockage, and their exposed secret. The facade of perfection and power Vance had carefully cultivated crumbled spectacularly. Community pressure intensified. A petition demanding Vance's resignation as HOA president gathered signatures from a majority of residents within days. Simultaneously, rumblings of a potential class action lawsuit from other homeowners regarding her abuse of power and misuse of HOA funds grew louder. Facing isolation, the ire of her neighbors, and tangible legal threats, Eleanor Vance quietly submitted her resignation from the HOA presidency less than a week after the incident. Shortly thereafter, a for sale sign appeared in front of her mansion. Her downfall was swift and total. Her two former board allies, likely seeing the writing on the wall, also quietly withdrew from seeking re-election to their positions in the promptly organized special election, unwilling to face the judgment of their neighbors. A new HOA board was elected, composed of more moderate faces who pledged a strong commitment to transparency, accountability, and crucially, respect for individual homeowner rights. One of their first official acts was to send a formal letter of apology to our family. It expressed deep regret for what had happened, acknowledged the historical value of the oak, and admitted the injustice we had endured. As a practical gesture of reconciliation, they even offered to contribute funds from the community budget towards planting a new mature tree in our yard, should we desire it. It was a small act, but it held significant meaning in helping to heal the community rift. The loss of the ancient oak remains a scar that will never fully fade from my family. Every glance at the empty front yard brings a pang of sadness and regret. Yet, from that painful loss, something positive emerged and took root in the Willow Creek community. The battle over the oak inadvertently forged stronger neighborhood bonds in an unexpected way. People became more vigilant about any signs of power abuse, however small, and more willing to speak up and support one another. There's a new cohesion, a stronger sense of community built on a foundation of transparency and mutual respect. We decided against planting another oak in the same spot. Nothing could truly replace our century-old friend. Instead, we chose to plant a Japanese maple in a different part of the yard, known for its vibrant red fall foliage. It isn't a replacement, but a symbol of a new beginning, a new chapter for our family and for the neighborhood. Our front yard is sunnier now, more open, but it also serves as a permanent reminder. It reminds us of the beauty that was lost, but also of the latent power of truth, the importance of never staying silent in the face of injustice, and the necessity of persistently defending what is rightfully yours. Occasionally, on walks around the neighborhood, I still catch glimpses of Vance's former neighbors grappling with issues arising from their hastily installed new plumbing systems. I don't feel schadenfreude. The pain of losing the oak is too real for that. But there is, undeniably, a quiet satisfaction, a sense that the scales of justice, however badly skewed initially, finally found their balance. They took our oak, but by forcing us to dig up the dirty secret they tried to bury beneath its roots, we made them pay a steep price for their arrogance and deceit. Sometimes, justice smells unpleasant, but it's justice nonetheless. You've just heard David Miller share his family history and their deep love for the ancient oak tree, a cherished symbol planted when his grandfather returned from the war. You've also felt the initial peace in Willow Creek and the oak's special place within the community. But how long did that peace last? How did such a beloved tree suddenly become a target? Who is Eleanor Vance, and what drove her to set her sights on the Miller family's legacy? Don't stop here. Keep listening to discover how the absurd excuse about leaves and the pool quickly escalated into a systematic campaign of harassment. What happened when David tried direct dialogue with the powerful HOA president? How did the threatening letters and baseless fines start, and how did the mounting pressure begin backing a family into a corner? The next part will reveal the opening moves in this uneven battle. Can truth and reason prevail against stubbornness and the abuse of power? Keep listening so you don't miss the dramatic developments to come. They called it the Community Wellness Pathway, a fancy name for a blatant act of trespass against Arthur Pendleton. The prestigious Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, HOA, had unilaterally seized a sunny portion of his backyard, precisely where the climbing roses his beloved late wife, Clara, had cherished and cultivated still proudly reached for the sky. Their purpose? Simply to lay down a cheap gravel shortcut, a convenience of dubious necessity. But what the HOA board didn't know, or perhaps had willfully ignored, was the secret hidden just beneath that freshly laid gravel. A secret with the potential to turn the lush green lawns and vibrant flower beds they boasted about at the community entrance landscaping into a withered, desolate mess. Could their carelessness, or perhaps greed, inadvertently arm an ordinary homeowner with an unexpected weapon to reclaim not only his stolen land but also his rightful peace? Arthur Pendleton, a 62-year-old retired mechanical engineer, had lived in this cozy brick house for nearly 3 decades. He and Clara had poured their sweat, effort, and love into designing and building the backyard garden, transforming it into a private oasis, a miniature paradise brimming with fruitful trees and fragrant, year-round blossoms. This land, for Arthur, was more than just physical property. It was a repository of his sweetest memories, a sacred space where he felt Clara's spirit most present. The Willow Creek Estates community, where he resided, always maintained a meticulously groomed appearance, a pride most evident in the magnificent public landscaping at the main entrance, a Persian rug-like lawn, perfectly trimmed, surrounded by beds of Dutch tulips and Japanese azaleas, all diligently cared for, consuming a significant portion of each resident's monthly maintenance fees. Many years ago, with the mind of an engineer and skillful hands, Arthur had personally designed and installed a complex automatic irrigation system for his own garden. Recognizing the potential and acting out of goodwill to save the community costs at the time, he had generously extended this system. He created a single underground network powerful enough to water both his private garden and the entire expensive public landscaping area managed by the HOA out front. For the first few years, he even volunteered to manage the watering schedule before the HOA decided to hire a professional landscaping company. Every pipe, every control valve beneath the soil, he knew their exact location and function like the back of his hand. Arthur's property lines were always clearly defined on the county planning maps. The installation and sharing of the irrigation system back then were based entirely on trust and good neighborly spirit, long before the current HOA board came into power with its rigid regulations. Most importantly, there had never been any legal document or formal agreement signed granting the HOA permanent ownership or usage rights to the components of the irrigation system located squarely within the boundaries of Arthur's property. Until the incident occurred, Arthur's life flowed with the tranquility and desirable peace of retirement. He spent most of his time tending the garden, pruning Clara's climbing roses, reading by the sun-drenched window overlooking the verdant yard, and savoring the serenity this private space offered. His garden was always a beautiful highlight in the neighborhood, a vivid testament to dedicated care and a love for nature, an image starkly contrasting with the chaos and conflict about to erupt. The peace was abruptly shattered when Eleanor Vance, an ambitious real estate agent around 50, became the new HOA president. With her perfectly coiffed blonde hair and an obsession with increasing property values, she quickly initiated plans to upgrade Willow Creek Estates. Eleanor announced the Willow Creek Nature Walk project, an initiative that sounded community-oriented. However, the design plans revealed a suspicious truth. The path would cut across a corner of Arthur's backyard, creating a surprising shortcut leading directly to the home of Bernard Fletcher, the HOA secretary and Eleanor's staunch supporter. When Arthur Pendleton, with the inherent politeness of a man from a previous generation, presented his objections to the pathway project. He carefully pointed out the precise property lines on the survey map he always kept safe. He explained that the proposed path not only encroached upon his private space but also traversed the area where Clara's precious roses grew. Eleanor Vance, her professional smile unwavering, simply offered a perfunctory nod, her eyes glancing over the map as if it were nothing more than a meaningless doodle. "We've considered all factors, Mr. Pendleton," she stated, her tone implying his objection was merely a minor obstacle to be brushed aside. "This is for the common good of the Willow Creek community." That blatant dismissal was the first sign that this battle would not be fought on the grounds of reason or respect. Shortly thereafter, official letters began appearing in Arthur's mailbox. Not meeting invitations or typical community announcements, but warnings printed on expensive HOA letterhead. Their contents astonished Arthur with their pettiness and absurdity. The first letter accused him of violating landscaping regulations because a few branches of his ancient wisteria had extended, mere inches, over the imaginary fence line separating his yard from the public sidewalk. Arthur, ever meticulous, spent an afternoon trimming back the branches, though he felt the injustice keenly. But only days later, another letter arrived. This time, the violation was the paint color of the old wooden bench where he and Clara used to sit and read in the garden. Its faded green hue, which blended harmoniously with the natural setting, was now deemed non-compliant with the recently approved architectural color palette, a palette Arthur had never even been made aware of. Each letter concluded with a cold threat: if the violations were not corrected within 10 days, a fine of $50 per day would be imposed. Clearly, this wasn't about maintaining community standards, it was a deliberate campaign of harassment. Determined to defend his rights through proper channels, Arthur prepared thoroughly for the next HOA meeting. He brought a notarized copy of his deed, the detailed county-stamped survey map, and even photographs of his garden over the years, demonstrating his careful upkeep. When it was his turn to speak, he calmly restated his position, presenting the irrefutable legal evidence of his property boundaries. The atmosphere in the meeting room, attended by only a dozen or so residents, fell silent. However, Eleanor Vance and Bernard Fletcher were prepared. Eleanor, employing the skills of a seasoned real estate agent, deftly steered the discussion away from the concrete evidence Arthur presented. She began citing vague, arbitrarily interpreted clauses from the HOA's thick book of bylaws about the responsibility to contribute to projects improving the community's appearance. Bernard Fletcher, with a facade of false gravity, even hinted at the possible existence of some historical easement on Arthur's property, though he couldn't produce any documentation to prove it. "We appreciate your input, Mr. Pendleton," Eleanor concluded, her tone allowing no further argument. "But the board has voted to approve this project for the greater good. The work will proceed as planned." Arthur felt as though he'd been talking to a brick wall. His logic and evidence were utterly nullified by their stubbornness and self-appointed authority. A few days after the meeting, while getting his mail, Arthur encountered Bernard Fletcher by chance. The HOA secretary approached with a seemingly friendly smile. "Good morning, Arthur," Fletcher began, his voice even. "I just wanted to say, in a community like Willow Creek, cooperation is always appreciated. Those who know how to contribute to common initiatives often find life much more pleasant." He paused briefly, looking directly at Arthur. "Conversely, opposing efforts to improve the community can sometimes make things a bit less pleasant. You understand what I mean?" The words were mild, but the threatening implication was unmistakable. Arthur merely gave a stiff nod, saying nothing, a chill running down his spine. The harassment subsequently became more blatant. Fine notices started arriving, accusing Arthur of failing to correct the violation regarding the bench paint color, even though he had temporarily stored the bench in his shed. Next came an anonymous complaint filed with the HOA office, complaining about the noise from Arthur's lawnmower on a Saturday morning. Arthur always strictly adhered to the county's noise ordinance hours, only mowing during permitted times, yet the warning letter still arrived, reminding him of his duty to maintain neighborhood tranquility. The feeling of being watched, scrutinized, and cornered grew stronger each day. Arthur realized he couldn't fight this HOA machine alone. He decided to seek legal help. After consulting a friend, Arthur contacted Susan Hayes, a reputable local attorney specializing in real estate law and HOA disputes. In Susan's office, Arthur laid out the entire story, providing all the documents, letters, and even recounting the veiled threats he had endured. Susan listened attentively, meticulously reviewing the paperwork. Mr. Pendleton, she said after her review, her voice firm. Your ownership of that parcel of land is absolute and protected by law. The HOA's actions, from ignoring your evidence to harassing you with fabricated violations and planning construction on your land without consent or legal right, are entirely illegal. She explained that no HOA bylaw could override a legally recorded property deed. Susan drafted a formal and strongly worded cease and desist letter, demanding the HOA immediately halt all harassment, cancel the plans to build the walkway on Arthur's land, and confirm in writing their respect for his property boundaries. The letter was sent via certified mail to the HOA office. The response arrived a week later, not from Eleanor or the board, but from a large downtown law firm, clearly retained using the dues paid by Willow Creek residents themselves. The lengthy letter, filled with complex legal jargon, essentially rejected all of Susan Hayes' demands. They argued that the HOA board acted entirely within its authority to improve and maintain community value, and that the walkway project was necessary and reasonable. The letter also hinted that if Arthur continued to obstruct, the HOA might consider legal action to protect the community's interests. Arthur felt a heavy sense of disappointment, but Susan reassured him. This is a common intimidation tactic, Arthur, she said over the phone. They're trying to use their financial and legal muscle to make you back down. But the law is on your side. We have a very strong case if they dare to proceed. Hopes for a peaceful resolution vanished a few days later. When Arthur went into his backyard early one morning, he froze. A line of small wooden stakes, the kind used to mark construction sites, had been driven into the ground along the path the HOA intended to build, right on his carefully manicured lawn. They looked like small daggers piercing the heart of his garden. Anger flared, and Arthur yanked each stake out, tossing them aside. But his defiance lasted only a day. The next morning, new stakes, identical to the old ones, had reappeared in the exact same spots. It was a clear message: they would not be deterred. The HOA's stubbornness and audacity left Arthur feeling both furious and helpless. He realized that words and legal documents seemed to carry little weight with these people. And then, the actual assault happened. It was a stifling Tuesday morning. Arthur had a routine checkup scheduled with his cardiologist, an appointment he couldn't miss. He left home with a vague sense of unease. While sitting in the waiting room, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Peterson, the elderly neighbor across the street, her voice trembling and panicked. Arthur! You have to come home right away. There's a work crew, they're in your backyard. They have machinery, they're digging up the ground. They say they're putting in the HOA walkway. Arthur's heart clenched. He quickly thanked Mrs. Peterson, apologized to the doctor, and rushed out of the clinic. The drive home felt endless, his mind racing with anger and anxiety. He pictured the worst, his beloved garden destroyed. As he turned onto his familiar street, he could already hear the sound of a tiller and the voices of workers. The sight that greeted him was worse than he had imagined. A crew of about 5 or 6 workers in the uniform of a landscaping company was working with urgent haste. A strip of land about 3 feet wide had been dug up, the lush green sod overturned, exposing the damp brown earth beneath. A wheelbarrow full of gravel was being brought over, and one worker began spreading the gray, cheap-looking gravel onto the surface of the newly created path. And standing there, arms crossed with an undisguised look of triumph, was Eleanor Vance, supervising the work as if she owned the place. "Stop right now!" Arthur yelled, his voice hoarse with fury as he strode towards them. "What are you doing on my property? Get out of here immediately!" The workers paused, looking hesitantly at him, then at Eleanor. The HOA president turned, raising an eyebrow defiantly. "Mr. Pendleton," she said coolly, "we are carrying out a community improvement project duly approved by the board." She held up a piece of paper that looked like an official resolution, though Arthur couldn't read the content from a distance. "We have every right to perform the necessary work to enhance the value and utility of Willow Creek Estates on land designated for public purpose. This is my private property," Arthur growled, struggling to contain the boiling rage. "You have no right to be here. This is blatant trespassing." Eleanor merely shrugged dismissively. "If you have an issue, take it up with the HOA's attorneys." She turned back to the workers. "Keep working." Arthur pulled out his phone and immediately called Susan Hayes. He quickly described the situation, agitated. Susan, though equally outraged, advised him to remain calm. "Arthur, don't confront them directly. It could escalate things or even get you into legal trouble. Take pictures, take video of everything. Get the landscaping company's truck license plate, record Ms. Vance's words if you can. We need solid evidence. I'll file for an emergency injunction immediately, but the courts take time. Arthur felt a bitter helplessness. He stood there, on his own land, watching strangers brazenly dig up and destroy a part of the garden he and Clara had poured their hearts into cultivating. The gray gravel was laid down, covering the fertile soil, burying small plants, and utterly shattering the harmony and tranquility of the space. The shortcut took shape, an ugly scar across the corner of his yard, a testament to abuse of power and selfishness. Clara's climbing roses seemed to droop, pained by the cruel violation. Just then, Bernard Fletcher appeared, likely to check on the progress of the project, serving his convenience. Eleanor turned to speak with Fletcher, her voice loud enough for Arthur, standing not far away, to hear clearly over the noise of the machinery. "See, Bernard? Told you. Quick and easy," she smirked. "Now it's much more convenient for you to walk home from the main gate. No need to go around anymore." Those words struck Arthur like a physical blow. They confirmed what he had suspected: the so-called community wellness pathway was, in fact, merely a shortcut for the personal benefit of the HOA secretary, brazenly disguised. The anger inside him was now replaced by a cold feeling, a steely resolve. When the work crew finished and packed up their equipment, leaving behind the brand-new gravel path and a stunned Arthur Pendleton amidst the destruction, the sense of violation and fury still simmered in his chest. He picked up his phone again and dialed Susan. His voice was calmer now, but held a newfound determination. He recounted the details of what had just happened, particularly emphasizing the conversation he overheard between Eleanor and Bernard. "They didn't even bother to hide the real reason, Susan," he said. "That's clear proof of abuse of power and deceiving the community." Susan agreed. "That significantly strengthens our case, Arthur," she said. "We have ample grounds to sue for damages, demand restoration of the property, and potentially even ask the court to impose punitive measures for their willful trespass." Later that afternoon, after the initial shock subsided, Arthur went into the backyard to more closely inspect the extent of the damage. He walked along the new gravel path, his heart heavy. He knelt down, looking at the cheap gravel, feeling its rough texture beneath his fingertips. And then, a small but critically important detail caught his eye. At a point near the end of the path, squarely on his property, the gravel seemed slightly raised, and there was a faint rectangular outline beneath it. Arthur's heart skipped a beat. He knelt, carefully brushing the gravel aside with his hands. Beneath the thin layer was a familiar green metal cover, the lid of the main control valve box for the entire automatic irrigation system he had installed years ago. Not only the valve box, but he also recognized the placement of the main fittings and distribution pipes lying directly beneath the gravel of the illegal path. This was the heart of the irrigation system, the single point of origin supplying water to the lush green lawns and expensive flower beds in the public area out front that the HOA was so proud of. In their smugness and ignorance, they had built Bernard Fletcher's personal shortcut directly over the system's critical vulnerability, its sole control point, the very landscaping they spent so much money to maintain. The coincidence was staggering, almost fatefully ironic. Eleanor's words echoed in his head. "Now it's much more convenient for you to walk home." The true purpose was glaringly obvious. No further emails or documents were needed to prove this conspiracy. It was simply a blatant abuse of power for personal gain, masked by platitudes about the community. Arthur stood up, brushing the dirt from his hands, a cold calm settling over him. He pulled out his phone again and called Susan Hayes. "Susan," he said, his voice steady and devoid of emotion. "There's a new development. They built that path right over the main irrigation control valve box for the entire HOA common area. It's completely on my property." There was a momentary silence on the other end of the line. Susan, with her legal expertise, immediately grasped the significance of this discovery. "Arthur," she said slowly, choosing her words carefully, "technically and legally, that valve box and everything connected to it, being located within your property line, is entirely under your control. They trespass on your land to build that illegal structure. Therefore, you have the absolute right to decide what happens to anything on your property, including adjusting, repairing, or even removing any installations located there, especially when those installations were directly impacted by their act of trespass." A bold idea, a perfect counterattack plan, began to form clearly in Arthur Pendleton's mind. No more useless warning letters. No more stressful meetings where he was ignored. No waiting for a court ruling that could take months. Just action. Action based on his opponent's own foolish mistake. They had handed him the weapon themselves. The heatwave hit that weekend like a curse descending upon Willow Creek Estates. The thermometer climbed relentlessly. The air grew thick and sweltering. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, the sun a giant ball of fire scorching everything below. This just happened to be the weekend the HOA had scheduled its annual Summer Sparkle event, an outdoor evening party planned for Saturday right in the magnificent public landscaping area at the community entrance, the very place whose beauty depended entirely on the now compromised irrigation system. For Arthur Pendleton, this timing wasn't coincidental. It was perfect, an ideal stage for the denouement he had quietly prepared. He wasn't seeking gleeful revenge, but justice delivered silently and effectively. Early Saturday morning, before the first rays of sun had pierced the thin morning mist, and while most Willow Creek residents were still asleep, Arthur was in his backyard. There was no camera to record evidence, no need for witnesses. Just him, his familiar gardening tools, and a cold, steely determination that had replaced the anger and helplessness of the preceding days. He walked directly to the corner of the garden where the illegal gravel path cut across. With slow, deliberate movements, he began removing the freshly laid gravel from the section on his property. The gray gravel, symbolizing the brazen trespass, was neatly piled to one side. Beneath it, as he knew, lay the green metal lid of the main control valve box. With the experience and precision of a retired mechanical engineer, Arthur opened the valve box lid. Inside was the network of valves and fittings he had installed with his own hands years ago. He knew exactly which valve controlled the water flow to his own garden, and which one fed the complex irrigation system of the HOA's public area. His hand was steady as he firmly turned the valve handle supplying water to the public area, completely shutting off the supply from that branch. But merely closing the valve wasn't enough. He wanted to ensure there were no leaks, and more importantly, he wanted to completely sever this illegal physical connection from his land. He took out a wrench and disconnected the main fittings that led the pipes from his system to the HOA's. Then, he retrieved specialized plumbing caps, the kind used in the trade, and carefully sealed the pipe ends leading towards the HOA's side. It was a physical severance, decisive and irreversible without professional and costly intervention. The sole water supply for the HOA's public irrigation system, originating from the very land they had trespassed upon, was now completely disabled. Meanwhile, the valves leading to Arthur's private garden remained open, ensuring Clara's roses and the rest of his small oasis remained unaffected. Having completed the technical phase, Arthur began the restoration work. He didn't just refill the gravel. He carefully replaced the excavated soil, compacting it just right. Then, he took patches of lush green sod he had prepared from another corner of his garden and skillfully laid them over the surface, completely concealing the valve box and all traces of the path on his property. When he stood up and stepped back to survey his work, the corner of the garden was restored to its original state, seamless and green, as if the trespass had never occurred. The gravel path now ended abruptly at his property line, a truncated stub on public land, looking even more ridiculous and pointless. Arthur gathered his tools and went back inside as the sun began to climb, carrying the quiet satisfaction of a man who knew he had done what was necessary, entirely legally on his own land. At precisely 5 a.m., the HOA's automatic irrigation system, meticulously programmed by the landscaping company, was supposed to start. The sprinkler heads hidden underground should have slowly risen, spraying cool, life-giving water onto the thirsty lawn and flower beds in the early morning heat. But that morning, there was no familiar hiss of spraying water, no sparkling arcs of water catching the dawn light. Complete silence. Initially, nobody noticed. A few early morning joggers might have vaguely registered the difference but paid it no mind. However, as the sun climbed higher, the intensity of the summer heatwave began to take its toll. The dew evaporated, leaving the air parched. By around 10 a.m., the usually vibrant azaleas began to show signs of wilting, their petals limp. The tulip foliage, already past its prime, started yellowing rapidly. By noon, the situation became more obvious. The Persian rug-like lawn, Willow Creek's pride, normally a lush velvet green, was now mottled with patches of brownish yellow, especially in areas exposed directly to the harsh sun. The shrubs looked lifeless, their leaves drooping as if begging for water. The first call to the HOA office probably came from an observant resident. Then came more calls. The landscaping company was summoned urgently. 2 technicians arrived on site in the early afternoon and checked the sprinkler heads. They weren't clogged. They checked the main water meters supplying the entire landscape area. The meter was running. Water pressure from the city's main supply was perfectly normal. They checked the automatic controller. Everything was functioning according to its settings. The problem lay somewhere between the supply source and the sprinkler heads, but they couldn't pinpoint it. Water simply wasn't reaching its destination. Bewilderment was clear on their faces as they reported back to Eleanor Vance over the phone. Meanwhile, Bernard Fletcher, walking home during his lunch break, discovered that part of his convenient shortcut had vanished, replaced by a patch of fresh sod. His anger over this personal inconvenience prompted him to call Eleanor immediately, complaining that Old Man Pendleton had sabotaged the public works project. But Fletcher's irritation was quickly overshadowed by the larger crisis unfolding. Eleanor's phone began ringing incessantly. Other residents, witnessing the community's pride wilting before their eyes, called to complain and demand answers. The monthly cost of maintaining this landscaping was a significant line item in the HOA budget, and now that investment was literally dying, right before the Summer Sparkle event Eleanor had heavily promoted. The pressure mounted on the president. Late that afternoon, as the heat remained oppressive and the festive atmosphere planned for the evening party began to evaporate under a cloud of worry, Eleanor Vance could take no more. Her face flushed from both the heat and unchecked fury. She strode quickly to Arthur Pendleton's house, ringing the doorbell repeatedly as if trying to break it down. Arthur opened the door, calmly facing the woman who was panting with rage. Her eyes were blazing. "Mr. Pendleton!" she yelled, dispensing with even basic greetings. "What did you do to the irrigation system? Tell me!" Arthur looked directly into Eleanor's eyes, his voice even, without a hint of fluctuation. "Ms. Vance, I did nothing to the irrigation system." He paused slightly, letting the words hang in the tense air. "I simply exercised my rights on my property. I restored my land to its original state, before it was illegally trespassed upon by your crew last Tuesday." Eleanor gaped, stunned by his composure. "Restored? What are you talking about? All structures, fixtures, or devices illegally installed on my land during that trespass," Arthur continued, his voice retaining its deadly calm, "including those located beneath the so-called walkway you had built, have been removed and relocated from my property boundaries." He opened the door slightly wider, directing Eleanor's gaze towards the backyard. Where the gravel path had once cut across, there was now a seamless patch of green grass, showing no trace of the previous intrusion. "As you can see, my garden is back to how it was." Eleanor stared at the restored yard, then back at Arthur's placid face. The anger in her eyes was now mixed with confusion and perhaps a faint flicker of fear as the consequences began to dawn on her. But the water! The plants out there are dying. You have to turn it back on." Arthur shook his head slightly. "Ms. Vance, I have no legal or moral obligation to maintain, repair, or provide any utility connection serving the HOA from within my property boundaries. Especially when that connection," he emphasized each word, "was impacted by, or rather, located directly beneath, the trespassing structure the HOA itself built. Your actions led directly to this situation. The irrigation system's problem is the HOA's problem, not mine." He stood tall, his gaze steady. "I hope you and the board have a truly sparkling summer evening." With that, he slowly closed the door, leaving Eleanor Vance standing stunned in the oppressive heat amidst a mess entirely of her own making. The Summer Sparkle event lived up to its name, but in an entirely different sense. The scene at the entrance area was not magnificent but pathetic under the decorative lights. The flower beds, once proudly showcasing vibrant colors, were now wilted and drooping. The lush green lawn had turned a sickly yellow-brown, dry and brittle. Instead of murmurs of admiration, the party atmosphere was filled with hushed whispers and concerned glances towards the dying landscape. News of the real cause spread quickly. The sole irrigation system had been disabled due to the HOA president's own actions in building an illegal walkway on Arthur Pendleton's land. The estimated cost to install a completely new system, one that didn't cross Arthur's property, was staggering, threatening to deplete the HOA's reserve funds or necessitate a fee increase. The root of the problem, the illegal walkway built for personal benefit, became the focus of all criticism. The community's attitude shifted rapidly. Initial frustration about the wilting landscape transformed into anger directed squarely at Eleanor Vance and Bernard Fletcher. Arthur, previously perhaps seen by some as a difficult neighbor, was now widely viewed as a victim who had defended himself intelligently and entirely legally on his own property. Questions began to be asked openly. Why did the board approve a project that trespassed on a resident's property? Why were HOA funds used for a path clearly benefiting only one member? Who was going to be responsible for the enormous repair costs? Amidst this turmoil, attorney Susan Hayes sent a formal letter to the entire HOA board, not only reiterating the blatant trespass but also clearly stating Arthur's absolute legal right to control everything on his property, including the removal of illegal structures. The letter suggested the HOA voluntarily remove the remainder of the gravel path on common ground and compensate Arthur for his legal fees to avoid a much costlier civil lawsuit. Simultaneously, Arthur calmly explained the situation to neighbors who inquired, gently emphasizing that he had only acted to protect his property rights after being trespassed upon. The pressure from the community and the legal threat emboldened previously dissenting voices on the board. A few members admitted that the walkway project had been pushed through hastily by Eleanor and Bernard, bypassing standard procedures and completely ignoring Arthur's valid objections. Faced with the growing chaos and outrage, a group of residents formally submitted a petition demanding an emergency HOA meeting, requiring Eleanor Vance and Bernard Fletcher to publicly account for their actions. The emergency HOA meeting convened in an atmosphere thick with tension. The community hall was packed with residents, many wearing expressions of anger and demanding answers. Eleanor Vance and Bernard Fletcher sat at the head table, attempting to maintain composure but exchanging nervous glances. When asked to explain, Eleanor tried to repeat her old arguments about community benefit and board authority, but her voice lacked its usual confidence. Bernard Fletcher stammered about misunderstandings and procedures, but their justifications were quickly drowned out by sharp, pointed questions from the floor. People wanted to know why a long-term resident's property was violated, why common funds were used for a questionable path, and who was going to pay to fix the dying irrigation system. Into the fray stepped attorney Susan Hayes, bringing professional calm. She clearly and methodically presented the case again, highlighting not only the illegal trespass but also providing preliminary cost estimates for designing and installing a completely new irrigation system, a figure that silenced the hall with its magnitude. She also didn't fail to mention the risk of a costly civil lawsuit the HOA was almost certain to lose. Faced with the palpable anger of the majority, irrefutable legal evidence, and a grim financial outlook, the power Eleanor Vance once wielded seemed to evaporate. The habitual smugness on her face was replaced by confusion and defeat. Under immense pressure, the HOA board, likely comprising some new faces or older members who had rediscovered their voices, held a vote. The result was a complete reversal. They unanimously passed a resolution that included, first, issuing a formal and public apology to Mr. Arthur Pendleton for the distress and damages caused. Second, immediately hiring a different company to completely remove the remainder of the gravel path on common ground, restoring it to its original state. Third, reimbursing Arthur for all reasonable legal fees incurred, along with symbolic compensation for the minor damages to his garden. And finally, most significantly, accepting that the HOA would bear the full responsibility and cost for designing and installing the new irrigation system for the common area, with no connection to or impact on Arthur's property whatsoever. Not long after the meeting, Eleanor Vance and Bernard Fletcher quietly resigned from the board, facing the implicit ostracism of the very community they had tried to manipulate. The changes happened quickly. The shameful shortcut disappeared, leaving only faint scars on the common ground awaiting restoration. Arthur's garden regained its sacred integrity. The HOA was forced to allocate a substantial sum from its reserve funds, possibly necessitating future fee increases, to begin the expensive process of salvaging the front landscaping. It was a costly lesson, paid for in dollars and reputation, about the necessity of respecting private property lines. The relationship between Arthur and the HOA became clearer afterward. There were no phony reconciliation parties or forced cordiality. Instead, there was a respect based on law and boundaries painfully re-established. Arthur earned newfound admiration from many neighbors, not just for his beautiful garden, but for his quiet courage and the intelligent, effective way he defended his rights. Within Willow Creek, the incident became a lasting reminder of the limits of any association's power and the severe consequences of abusing authority for personal gain. Future project approval processes would undoubtedly be scrutinized more carefully to ensure transparency and respect for homeowners' rights. Arthur Pendleton, back in the restored quietude of his cherished garden, sat on the old wooden bench he'd retrieved from the shed, watching Clara's roses slowly recover under his care. He realized something profound. Sometimes, the best way to protect what you love isn't through direct confrontation with force or harsh words. It lies in understanding the value of what you possess, knowing your legal rights, and just as importantly, recognizing the weaknesses, the oversights, your opponent might carelessly expose right under your feet. Property ownership wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the tangible control over what happened within those boundaries. And the slightest disrespect for that boundary could trigger unforeseen consequences, turning the trespasser's arrogance into the very tool of their own downfall. That story about Mark Evans and his neighbor Brenda Miller certainly delivered a satisfying moment of comeuppance, didn't it? The way the truth came out right in front of the person making the complaint was unforgettable. But if you thought that was the peak of neighborly disputes or abuses of power, brace yourselves. This next story brings us to Arthur Pendleton, a man facing a situation even more ironic and significantly more serious. Imagine your homeowners association not just sending complaint letters, but actually seizing part of your beloved backyard, land tied to memories of your late wife, just to create a cheap shortcut for a board member. Arthur seemed powerless against the HOA machine, until he discovered their fatal mistake. They had built their illegal structure right over the single vulnerability, the Achilles heel, of the expensive landscaping system the HOA itself was so proud of. How did a quiet, retired engineer manage to turn the HOA's ignorance and arrogance into his own weapon? His retaliation wasn't loud, wasn't confrontational, but it was incredibly clever, perfectly legal, and utterly devastating to their plans. Are you curious to find out exactly what Arthur did with that shocking discovery? What happens when the HOA's pride and joy starts to wither under the scorching sun? Don't go anywhere. The story of Arthur Pendleton's calculated counterattack is about to begin. The doorbell rang just as I, Mark Evans, was settling down to relax after a long day at the office. Looking through the window, I saw the familiar city animal control truck pull up to the curb. And standing next to it, hands on her hips, face scrunched up, was none other than my neighbor, Mrs. Brenda Miller. I sighed. This had to be about Max, the rescue German shepherd I was fostering. Max occasionally let out a few barks when strangers passed the fence, but he was definitely not aggressive. Brenda tended to see everything through the most negative lens possible. She was gesturing frantically towards my house, clearly waiting for an official to arrive and restore order, completely unaware that the very person she wanted called to handle it was me, the head of animal control. The show was about to begin. I opened the door just as my officer, Dave Jenkins, a young but very dedicated guy in his standard-issue green animal control uniform, stepped out of the white truck with the city logo. Before Dave could even get his footing on the sidewalk, Mrs. Brenda Miller descended on him like a whirlwind, her face flushed with anger, her shrill voice cutting through the peaceful afternoon birdsong. "Officer Jenkins, thank goodness you're here. This dog, Mr. Evans' dog here, he's a menace. He barks non-stop. From sunup to sundown, practically all night. I can't get a wink of sleep, I can't read a book, I can't even hear my own TV. That sound is constant torture." She pointed a trembling finger towards Max, my German shepherd, who was now sitting calmly behind the sturdy chain-link fence in the yard, ears perked curiously at the arrival of the stranger and the familiar truck, his tail even giving a slight, friendly wag. "And look at the way he stares." Brenda continued her onslaught. "That look in his eyes. It's menacing. He glares at everyone who walks by like he wants to eat them alive. I swear I've seen him bare his teeth several times, just waiting for a chance to break loose and attack. He's a danger to this whole neighborhood, especially the children." Dave Jenkins, though young, was already familiar with these kinds of calls. He maintained a professional demeanor, nodding politely to Brenda before turning to me, a flicker of surprise and confusion crossing his eyes as he realized the homeowner was his boss. However, he quickly regained his composure. "Good afternoon, Mr. Evans. We received a complaint regarding excessive noise and potentially dangerous behavior from a pet at this address." Dave's voice was even and by the book, just as he'd been trained. Brenda didn't give me a second to respond. She jumped in again, her voice growing even sharper, as if afraid my presence might undermine the young officer's resolve. "That's right. Exactly. I demand you inspect this animal immediately. Don't just stand there looking. You need to get in there, Examine him thoroughly. He needs a psychological evaluation by an expert. I'm sure he's mentally unstable. Maybe he needs to be removed from here, taken somewhere safer for the community. The law is the law, Officer Jenkins. It must be enforced equally for everyone, even if he happens to be my neighbor and looks respectable." She crossed her arms tightly, chin jutting out, a look of grim determination and self-righteousness on her face, as if she were single-handedly fighting some dark force threatening the peace of the subdivision. I took a deep breath, trying to suppress my rising irritation. I knew Brenda. She always tended to exaggerate things and view issues in the worst possible light. I kept my voice calm, explaining patiently, trying to use reason to de-escalate the situation. "Mrs. Miller, I understand your concern, but let me assure you again. Max is a rescue dog. He went through very thorough basic training and rehabilitation before coming to me. Yes, he does bark when strangers, cars, or sometimes other animals like squirrels or cats pass the fence. That's a completely normal territorial instinct for dogs, especially for a German Shepherd, which are known for being loyal and alert. He doesn't bark nonstop for hours like you described, just a few short alert barks. And most importantly, he is always securely contained in my yard, behind a solid fence with a gate that is always latched. He doesn't roam free, has never had direct contact with passers-by, and has certainly never shown any actual aggressive behavior like attacking or biting." I turned to Dave, trying to establish a professional connection. "You know, Dave, in our line of work, we encounter many cases of dogs barking out of vigilance or due to external triggers. It's not always a sign of danger." But my reasoning was like water off a duck's back to Brenda. She let out a sarcastic scoff. "You're just making excuses for your monster, Mr. Evans. Training? Rescue? Sounds so noble. But the truth is, he's still an animal. I've heard him growling. A low, menacing sound coming from your yard at night. Probably plotting something vicious." She pointed again towards a corner of the yard, where there was a small depression in the dirt under the maple tree. "And look what he's done to the yard. He digs everywhere like a destructive menace. It won't be long before he digs under the fence and gets out. Will you take responsibility then if he attacks someone?" The truth was, Max just liked digging a shallow hole there to lie in and stay cool on hot days, and the hole was nowhere near big enough for him to escape through. "And his barking," Brenda continued her endless lament. "You say it doesn't echo? That's ridiculous. I bet people at the end of the street can hear it. His bark is piercing, nerve-wracking. It echoes through the whole neighborhood, shattering the peace we deserve." She whirled back to Dave, her eyes blazing, her voice urgent and almost commanding. "Officer Jenkins! What are you standing there for? Are you going to do something to protect the public? Or are you afraid of him because he's your neighbor? Or perhaps, is there some other relationship I don't know about?" The last question dripped with insinuation and suspicion, an attempt to psychologically pressure the young officer. Dave clearly looked uncomfortable. He glanced at Max, who was still sitting quietly, occasionally licking his chops benignly. Then he looked at me, his superior, standing right here as the homeowner being complained about. Finally, he looked back at Mrs. Brenda, who was simmering like a kettle about to boil over. He cleared his throat, striving for professionalism. "Ma'am, based on my initial observation here and the information from the homeowner, the dog is securely contained on private property behind adequate fencing. Regarding the noise, occasional barking due to external stimuli is not typically considered a violation of city noise ordinances unless it's sustained for a significant period, especially during designated quiet hours, or if the volume is clearly and unusually excessive." "Unusual?" Brenda cut Dave off abruptly, not letting him finish his sentence or explain further. "What's more unusual than him barking like crazy at the mailman every morning? He's just doing his job. He barks his head off at the neighbor kids when they ride their bikes past. They're terrified. He even barks at my poor cat if she dares to venture near the fence. Isn't that unusual? That's the very definition of a public nuisance." She stamped her foot on the sidewalk, planted her hands back on her hips, striking the pose of an upstanding citizen whose rights were being violated. "I will not accept this answer. I will not accept this indifference. I am going to file a formal complaint. I'll send it to your direct supervisor. I'll send it to the mayor's office if I have to. I will ensure that concrete action is taken against this dog and against your lack of responsible enforcement." She delivered this tirade in a threatening tone, as if wielding some invisible power capable of shaking the entire city administration. I could almost see the smug satisfaction glittering in her eyes, convinced she held all the cards and was about to teach this stubborn neighbor a lesson he wouldn't forget. Her ignorance of the actual ordinances, her stubbornness, and her blind faith in her own perspective made her utterly ridiculous. I just stood there, waiting patiently, wondering how much longer this ironic drama would play out before the truth finally came to light and her balloon of righteous anger deflated against an unexpected reality. Brenda's complaint storm seemed to be just gathering strength, and she was escalating the conflict, completely unaware she was marching straight towards a brick wall of truth. Dave Jenkins was clearly in a tight spot. On one side, a citizen complaining vehemently, on the other, me. He took a breath, trying to stay calm and professional. "Mrs. Miller, I understand your frustration, but based on regulations and the current situation, I see no grounds to issue a citation or remove the dog at this time. The dog is securely contained, shows no signs of neglect or uncontrolled aggression." Brenda practically shrieked. "No grounds? Are you kidding me? Did you hear a word I said? Or are you just covering for him?" She pointed directly at me. "I demand to speak to your supervisor. Right now. I want to know who's in charge of this useless department." That was the moment I'd been waiting for. Dave looked at me, a silent plea in his eyes. I gave a slight nod. Dave turned back to face Brenda, his voice taking on a very formal tone. "Mrs. Miller, you are speaking to my supervisor." Brenda froze, her expression shifting from fury to utter bewilderment. What did you say?" Dave cleared his throat again, looking directly at me with deference. "Oh, good afternoon, Chief Evans. Sorry to disturb your day off, sir. Dispatch just reported a complaint at this address. I didn't realize it was your residence." The air seemed to thicken. Brenda's jaw dropped. She looked at me, then at Dave, then back at me, her eyes wide with disbelief. The red flush on her face drained away, replaced by a pale hue of shock and mortification. Chief?" she stammered. I took a step forward, offering a professional but firm smile. "That's correct, Mrs. Miller. I'm Mark Evans, Chief of City Animal Control. And Max," I gestured to the dog now wagging his tail gently, "is my personal rescue dog, fully trained and in complete compliance with all city pet ordinances, ordinances I myself am responsible for enforcing. Is there anything specific about his aggressive behavior or non-stop noise that you'd like me, as the head of the department, to address directly?" The power dynamic and the truth had completely flipped the situation. Silence fell. Brenda Miller stood rooted to the spot, her face alternating between flushed and pale. She tried to say something, but only incoherent stammers came out. The confident, bossy demeanor from moments ago had vanished entirely, replaced by unconcealable confusion and embarrassment. She realized she had called the head of the very department she was complaining to, about him and his dog. Dave Jenkins, seeing the situation was resolved, quickly wrapped things up. He keyed his radio, reporting briefly back to dispatch. "Unit 7 reporting, check the address. Complaint unfounded. Situation stable. Clearing the call." He clipped his radio back, turned to me with a professional nod. "Anything else, Chief Evans?" "No, thank you for coming out, Dave." "Handled well," I replied, keeping my tone even. Brenda, unable to bear the humiliation any longer, mumbled something that sounded like, I have to go," spun around, practically ran back to her house, and slammed the door shut. The slam echoed like a bitter final punctuation mark on her quest for justice. Dave suppressed a smile, shook his head slightly, and headed back to his truck, driving away. I closed the door, and Max immediately nudged his head against my leg as if offering comfort. I bent down and scratched behind his ears. "See, Max? Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction." The loyal dog just tilted his head, his intelligent eyes full of trust. Life in the neighborhood would probably be a little quieter, at least from Mrs. Miller's direction, for a while. This incident was a humorous, albeit tiring, reminder of the nature of my job, sometimes dealing with absurd complaints, even off the clock. But it also reinforced my belief in the work I do, protecting animals and maintaining a reasonable balance within the community. Brenda might have learned a lesson about getting her facts straight before acting, or at least finding out who her neighbors are. As for me, I just knew Max was a great member of the family, and no baseless complaint could change that. Justice, in its own peculiar way, had been served right on my doorstep. Wow, folks, you heard it. Brenda really stepped in it, calling animal control on her own boss's dog, right? Talk about an epic cell phone. You'd think that's about as absurd as it gets. But hold on. If you thought that face-to-face showdown was peak ridiculousness and drama, brace yourselves. Because the next story I've got for you takes the concept of nightmare neighbor and overreach to a whole new level, a crosstown level. Picture this, you're minding your own business, enjoying your morning coffee, when the cops show up at your door. The reason? Not because you did anything wrong, but because a woman in a town 30 minutes away, the self-proclaimed president of an HOA you've never heard of, saw your boat on Google Maps Street View and decided it violated her HOA rules. Yes, you heard that right. Google Maps. And folks, that's just the beginning. The battle didn't stop with one pointless police call. It escalated into a long-distance harassment campaign, with emails from code enforcement, smear campaigns on social media, fake violation notices stuffed in the mailbox, anonymous phone calls, and the grand finale, a lawsuit in small claims court, in her county. How will David Chen, the owner of the innocent boat Bluefin, handle the cross-jurisdictional wrath of the Google Maps HOA queen, Beatrice Albright? Is there any limit to the absurdity? Don't go anywhere. Stick around as we dive into the dramatic, and utterly ridiculous, saga of the battle over the Google Maps boat, right now. I was halfway through my morning coffee on the porch, enjoying the rare suburban quiet, when I heard sirens. Not one, but two police cruisers turned onto my cul-de-sac and pulled up right in front of my gravel driveway. Flashing lights reflected off the windows, shattering the morning calm. I blinked, completely bewildered. The only crime being committed on my property was me trying to enjoy a hot cup of coffee in my pajamas. What on earth was going on? An older officer, looking tired despite the early hour, stepped out, followed by a younger partner. He approached me, hand briefly touching the brim of his cap. "Morning, sir." His voice was even. "I'm Officer Miller, this is Officer Davis. We received a call reporting a code violation at this address." I frowned, setting my coffee mug down. "A violation? What regulation? And whose?" "My neighborhood doesn't have a homeowners association, HOA. That was one of the reasons I chose to live here." Officer Miller sighed lightly. "That's part of the confusion, sir. The call came from a woman named Beatrice Albright, identifying herself as the HOA president for the Maple Creek subdivision." I shook my head. "Maple Creek? I've never even heard of it. It's definitely not around here." "We know," Officer Davis chimed in, looking slightly awkward. "Maple Creek is about a 30-minute drive east of here. Ms. Albright called her local police department, reporting a boat parked in a driveway violating their HOA rules. They forwarded the call to us because the address she gave is in our jurisdiction." I almost laughed at the absurdity. I pointed towards the old fishing boat, carefully tucked and parked neatly beside the garage. "You mean the Bluefin? It's been parked there for a year now. Who's it bothering?" I looked at the two officers, still baffled. "And who is this Albright woman to be concerned about my driveway in a completely different town?" Officer Miller rubbed his temples. "According to what she told our dispatcher, she was patrolling the surrounding areas on Google Maps Street View." My jaw dropped. She used Google Maps to call the cops about my boat in another town? This crossed the line from bizarre straight into the territory of ridiculous. "That picture could be years old." "Our thoughts exactly," Officer Miller admitted, glancing at the boat, then back at me. "We obviously can't enforce the rules of a Maple Creek HOA here in Oakwood. And frankly, Mr. Chen," he lowered his voice, "the boat looks perfectly fine. It's not obstructing any public way, doesn't look derelict." Officer Davis suppressed a smile. "Sounds like Ms. Albright has a bit too much time on her hands." I sighed, trying to regain my composure. My initial annoyance was slowly turning into bewildered amusement at the sheer oddity of it all. "So, what now?" "Nothing," Officer Miller said. "It was standard procedure to check out a relayed call. We'll document the situation, explain it to their dispatcher, and perhaps they'll advise Ms. Albright on a more appropriate use of police resources." He nodded a farewell. "Sorry to have bothered you this morning, Mr. Chen." The two officers walked back to their cars, shaking their heads. As they drove away, restoring quiet to the street, I stood there, hands on my hips, staring at the innocent Bluefin. Beatrice Albright, I muttered. Who are you? I picked up my now cold coffee mug, my peaceful morning violated by some unseen, absurd force from 30 minutes away. I thought that would be the end of it, just a weird story to tell my friends, a one-off incident involving a woman with too much time in Google Maps. But I was wrong. Beatrice Albright wasn't done. A few days later, I started noticing strange things. First was an email from Oakwood's Code Enforcement Department, inquiring about the boat reported as an eyesore in my driveway. The email seemed hesitant, almost apologetic, and mentioned the complaint came from a concerned citizen in another town. I called back, explained the police visit and the Google Maps situation. The person on the other end sighed wearily. Her again? She's called us 3 times this week already. Clearly, Beatrice didn't take no for an answer. Then, things escalated online. My good neighbor, Mr. Henderson, a tech-savvy retiree, stumbled upon a post in a regional community Facebook group, which Beatrice had somehow joined. She'd posted a grainy, outdated Google Street View screenshot of my house, the blue fin front and center, with an indignant caption. Look at the blight spreading into our neighboring areas. Eyesores like this lower property values for everyone. We must take action before it's too late. The post, of course, failed to mention this neighboring area was a half-hour drive away and in a completely different jurisdiction. But the members of her Maple Creek HOA group didn't know that. The comments section quickly filled with outrage aimed at the inconsiderate homeowner, me. Disgusting, someone has to do something. This is why we need strong HOAs. How can the local government allow this? Mr. Henderson shook his head as he showed me. This Beatrice woman is notorious over in Maple Creek, David. Runs that HOA like a queen. Fined people for the wrong shade of front door paint, threatened to sue a family over kids' sidewalk chalk. She sees enforcing rules, anyone's rules, as her life's mission. But these aren't her rules, and it's not her neighborhood. I protested, feeling my face flush. That won't stop her, Mr. Henderson warned. If she thinks she's right, she won't back down. And he was correct. Beatrice, emboldened perhaps by the online support from the uninformed, decided to up the ante. About a week later, I found an official-looking letter in my mailbox. The envelope had no postmark, just my address printed on it. Inside was an official notice of violation from the Maple Creek HOA Executive Board, demanding I remove the boat within 14 days or face further legal action, including but not limited to fines and property liens. I actually laughed out loud. The notice was printed on a home printer, the HOA logo looked clumsily cut and pasted, and the legalese was clunky and riddled with typos. Had she actually driven 30 minutes herself to stuff it in my mailbox? The audacity was astounding. I decided to ignore it. She had no authority, no legal basis. It was a farce. But Beatrice wasn't one to give up easily. A few days after the violation notice, I got a call from an unknown number. A woman's voice chirped, asking if I was the owner of the dangerous boat. When I asked who she was and why she was calling, she launched into a tirade about the boat being a potential hazard to children and a serious eyesore. I recognized the familiar judgmental tone from the Facebook comments. Apparently, Beatrice had started mobilizing like-minded individuals to call me directly. How she got my number, I don't know, public records probably. I calmly explained she'd been misled by someone in another town, that the boat was perfectly legal and safe, and asked her not to call again. That call, and a few more like it, made me realize this harassment wasn't going to just disappear. Beatrice was actively trying to make my life hell from afar, all because she didn't like my boat in an online photo. I started taking screenshots of the Facebook posts, saving the bizarre voicemails, and documenting every interaction. I didn't want to fight, but I needed to be prepared. Mr. Henderson was right, she wouldn't stop. She was enjoying this. Beatrice Albright's persistence reached a new peak of absurdity when a much more official-looking letter arrived via certified mail. This time, it wasn't a homemade notice of violation, but a summons from the small claims court of the county where Maple Creek was located, not my county. I read the filing, eyes wide with disbelief. Beatrice Albright was suing David Chen, me, for $500 for emotional distress and diminished community property value, due to the display of an unsightly and non-compliant watercraft. She listed the Maple Creek HOA as the injured party, despite me not being a member and my property being a world away. I immediately called my lawyer buddy, Alex. After I recounted the entire saga, from the Google Maps incident to the fake letters and now this ridiculous lawsuit, Alex couldn't help but laugh over the phone. "David, this has got to be one of the most bizarre HOA overreach cases I've ever heard," he said after regaining his composure. "She's suing you in her county court? Over your boat in your county? Based on her HOA rules?" "Exactly," I replied, still finding it hard to believe. "Okay," Alex said, amusement in his voice. "Technically, she has zero legal standing. No jurisdiction, no standing to sue, no actual damages related to her or her HOA from your boat. We can easily file a motion to dismiss for lack of jurisdiction. The judge will toss it out immediately." "I know," I said. "But part of me wants to go. I want to see this Beatrice woman's face. I want to hear the judge tell her to her face how insane this is." Alex chuckled. "I get that. All right, if you want the satisfaction, I'll draft up a quick brief outlining the dismissal grounds. You just present it. It'll be quick." And so, on a Tuesday morning, I drove the 30 minutes to the unfamiliar town of Maple Creek, to the drab-looking county courthouse. The small claims courtroom was small, with only a few people waiting. And there she was, sitting at the plaintiff's table, a petite woman with tightly pinned hair, cat-eye glasses, and an air of smug confidence. Beatrice Albright, undoubtedly. She glanced at me as I entered, a small smirk touching her lips. When our case was called, Beatrice stood and launched into a dramatic speech about her mission to protect community aesthetics. The anguish she suffered knowing that blight, like my boat, existed so close by, and how I had ignored all reasonable attempts at communication. Judge Peterson, a weary-looking man who looked like he just wanted the day to end, cut her off mid-sentence. "Ms. Albright, the court has reviewed the filing. Does Mr. Chim reside within the jurisdiction of the Maple Creek HOA?" Beatrice hesitated. "Well, no, Your Honor." "Is the boat in question located within this county?" "No, it is not." "Then what possible legal standing do you or your HOA have to bring this suit against Mr. Chim regarding his boat on his property in another county, based on your internal HOA regulations?" Beatrice's confident facade crumbled. "But Your Honor, it affects us, aesthetically, and spiritually." Judge Peterson sighed, a sigh that contained the weariness of years dealing with petty disputes. "Ma'am, this court lacks jurisdiction. The plaintiff lacks standing. This case is dismissed." He banged his gavel lightly. "Next case." Beatrice's face flushed crimson with anger and embarrassment. She shot me a venomous glare. I managed to keep a neutral expression as I walked out of the courtroom, but couldn't suppress a small smile. However, Beatrice Albright, true to her obstinate nature, wasn't about to accept defeat quietly. She practically chased me out into the hallway, her voice shrill with indignation. "You think this is over, Mr. Chim?" she hissed, pointing a finger in my face. "You think you've won? You can't just keep that monstrosity there. It's an insult." I turned to face her. "Ms. Albright, the case was dismissed. The court has no jurisdiction. Your HOA has no authority over my property. This is over. Please leave me alone." "It's not over," she shrieked, face scarlet. "I'll find another way. I'll report you higher up. To the building inspector. To the environmental agency." She waved her arms wildly, looking completely unhinged. It was this desperation and stubbornness that pushed her too far. That evening and over the next few days, the Oakwood Police Department and Code Enforcement Office, my town, began receiving a flood of anonymous calls and emails reporting my boat, for oil leaks, harboring vermin, being structurally unsound. The calls became so frequent they were a genuine nuisance to the public offices. Recognizing the pattern and suspecting coordination, my town's police chief contacted the Maple Creek PD. They quickly identified Beatrice as the source of at least some of the calls through her phone number and suspicious social media activity, where she urged concerned citizens to take action. This time, Beatrice's actions had crossed the line from mere annoyance to abuse of public resources and potential organized harassment. The Maple Creek police chief, fed up with her antics following the dismissed lawsuit and complaints from Oakwood PD, paid Beatrice a personal visit. There was no arrest, but she received a stern warning about misusing emergency lines and public reporting systems, and harassing a citizen in another jurisdiction. News of the police visit and the reasons behind it spread quickly through the Maple Creek community. Neighbors already tired of her autocratic rule now had ammunition. They were embarrassed that her actions reflected badly on the neighborhood. At the next HOA meeting, she faced sharp criticism and a vote of no confidence. Her iron grip on the community began to crumble. Having lost face before the community she tried so hard to control, and perhaps realizing she'd gone too far, Beatrice Albright became unusually quiet. A few months later, Mr. Henderson casually mentioned that Beatrice had resigned from the HOA board and put her house up for sale. The public humiliation and loss of power were apparently too much for her to bear. On the day she moved out, I stood on my porch, holding a fresh, hot cup of coffee, looking down the driveway where the bluefin still sat peacefully under its tarp. A gentle breeze blew, carrying a real sense of peace. No more strange calls, no more meaningless threatening letters, no ghost of an HOA Karen from another town haunting me via Google Maps. I took a sip of coffee. Some people fight for noble principles. Some fight for power. And Beatrice? She fought over a boat on Google Maps. And in the end, she lost. Me? I just wanted to park my boat in peace. What an unbelievable story about Beatrice and her Google Maps patrol, right, folks? David finally got some peace with his boat, and that HOA president learned a lesson about jurisdiction, and maybe sensible internet usage. It's a prime example of the absurdity and overreach some HOAs are capable of. But hey, if you think the level of HOA absurdity and irony stops there, get ready. The next story I'm about to tell takes us to a whole new level of overconfidence and catastrophic mistakes. Imagine not calling the cops from afar, but an actual HOA compliance unit, complete with makeshift uniforms, a golf cart with cheap flashing amber lights, acting like they have real police authority. And the height of irony? They picked the wrong person to try and intimidate, none other than the police chief himself, conducting actual undercover surveillance. What happens when wannabe HOA cops go head-to-head with the real deal? Will they realize their colossal mistake? And how will the chief handle this ridiculous situation? The truth behind this patrol unit is even more shocking. Don't go anywhere, folks. The ultimate showdown of absurdity and justice is coming right up. You definitely don't want to miss it. It wasn't a peaceful morning in an easy chair. Today, Sheriff Jake Thompson sat in his unmarked sedan, parked discreetly at the end of a quiet block. A cold cup of coffee rested in the cup holder, his eyes fixed on the house across the street where there had been recent reports of suspicious activity. This was real police work, patience, observation, waiting. The air was still, the quiet broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant drone of a lawnmower. He was intensely focused. The midweek morning calm settled over the quiet suburban neighborhood. Inside the unremarkable gray sedan, Sheriff Jake Thompson maintained intense focus, his eyes locked on the cream-colored two-story house diagonally across the street. He'd been sitting here for nearly 2 hours, patiently observing. A recent burglary in the area had prompted him to take the lead himself, conducting discreet surveillance to look for any unusual activity, any unfamiliar car that might match the witness's vague description. The paper coffee cup in the holder was long cold, but that didn't matter. This work demanded patience, an almost meditative stillness, blending into the dull rhythm of the residential area so that abnormalities would stand out on their own. The drone of a lawnmower somewhere in the distance, the occasional bark of a dog, the rustle of wind through the maple leaves just starting to turn, all familiar background noises, easily ignored. Then, another sound intruded, disrupting the harmony. At first, just a faint whirring, but it grew steadily louder, the sound of a small but persistent electric motor. Jake frowned slightly, glancing quickly in his rearview mirror. A golf cart? Here? He watched it slowly approach from down the block, looking utterly out of place among the SUVs and sedans parked along the curb. It was painted a bland beige, the kind of color only a committee trying to avoid any controversy could choose. Stranger still, mounted on its roof was a light bar, not the official red and blue of police or fire, but the cheap amber kind, flashing with a slow, lifeless pulse, like something you'd see on a construction vehicle or maybe a mail carrier in certain communities. The golf cart rolled slowly, maneuvering past a minivan parked slightly askew, then headed straight for Jake's sedan. Annoyance began to creep into Jake's mind. He was working. Surveillance required absolute discretion. The appearance of anything attention-grabbing, especially a golf cart with flashing lights, was the last thing he needed. It could alert a potential suspect or, worse, draw unnecessary attention from curious neighbors. The golf cart slowed and then stopped right beside the sedan's driver's side window. The electric motor fell silent, leaving only a faint ticking sound from somewhere within its mechanics. The small plastic door of the golf cart swung open, and 3 men emerged. Jake squinted, observing them through the window. They wore what looked like security uniforms, but something was off. The light blue polo shirts seemed either too large or too tight in all the wrong places, the polyester fabric gleaming under the morning sun. Their khaki pants weren't much better, one pair dragging on the ground, another stopping awkwardly high above the ankles. They looked more like extras in a low-budget movie than professional security personnel. The first one out, clearly the leader, was a middle-aged man, slightly heavyset, with a thick horseshoe mustache meticulously trimmed in a style decades out of date. He wore a pair of large, mirrored sunglasses that hid the upper half of his face, making his expression impossible to read. He puffed out his considerable chest, attempting an air of authority, and took heavy steps toward Jake's car. The other 2, one tall and lanky with a nervous expression, the other short, stocky, and round-faced, hung back slightly, their hands dangling awkwardly as if unsure of their roles. The man with the mustache stopped right beside Jake's window. Without a word, he raised his hand and knocked sharply on the glass. It wasn't a polite tap, but a hard rap with his knuckles, loud enough to make a distinct thump inside the car's confined space. The sound felt like a crude invasion of Jake's concentration and personal space. "Hey you!" the man's voice called out, attempting a deep tone of authority but coming out somewhat thin and strained. "Get out of the car, now!" Jake let out a slow breath, trying to suppress the rising irritation. He needed to stay calm. He was on duty, and an unnecessary confrontation would only complicate matters. He pressed the power window button, lowering the glass just a crack, enough to speak but still maintaining a safe distance and control. Outside air filtered in, carrying the scent of freshly cut grass and a faint whiff of exhaust from the golf cart. "Is there a problem, gentlemen?" Jake asked, his voice even, maintaining the calm, professional demeanor he'd honed over years on the force. He looked directly at the mirrored sunglasses, trying in vain to meet the man's eyes. The man with the mustache seemed slightly taken aback by Jake's composure, but quickly regained his facade of confidence. He puffed his chest out even further, a gesture he likely thought looked imposing, and pointed to the shiny badge clipped to his polyester shirt pocket. The badge looked cheap, made of brightly plated metal, with some sort of engraving Jake couldn't make out through the narrow opening. It resembled a child's toy more than a real symbol of authority. "We're with the HOA Compliance Unit," he announced, his tone as grand as if he were reading a vital proclamation. The name sounded ridiculous to Jake. The Homeowners Association now had a compliance unit with uniforms and its own patrol vehicle? The absurdity of the situation almost made him chuckle, but he held it back. The man with the mustache continued, his voice sharpening. "Your vehicle is parked suspiciously here and is in violation of neighborhood parking regulations. Show me your ID and registration, immediately." A moment of silence passed as Jake processed the absurd demand and the pompous self-proclaimed title. HOA Compliance Unit? A smirk almost automatically formed on his lips, not one of amusement but of sheer disbelief at the situation's absurdity. He was in the middle of criminal surveillance, trying to prevent a potential felony, and now he was being blocked by 3 clowns in homemade uniforms acting like federal agents. His patience, already tested by hours of fruitless waiting, began to fray rapidly. "The HOA has a patrol unit now?" Jake asked again, unable to completely hide the sarcastic edge in his voice this time. He glanced at the beige golf cart, then back at the men's sloppy uniforms. The man with the mustache either didn't register the sarcasm or chose to ignore it. He tilted his chin up, the mirrored sunglasses reflecting the blue sky. "That's right," he replied smugly. "And we are very serious about maintaining order and community standards. This unmarked car of yours has been parked here too long. It looks suspicious." Just then, the tall, lanky henchman standing behind stepped forward, holding a clipboard that looked artificially official. He cleared his throat, glancing down at the paper as if reading a critical legal document. "Per Section 7, Article 14 of the Community Regulations," he recited in a flat, unconfident voice. "Unidentified vehicles, without a resident permit or valid guest pass, are not permitted to park on public streets within the HOA's jurisdiction for more than 1 hour without prior registration with the HOA office." He looked up, glancing at his cheap wristwatch. "According to our records, you've been here almost 2 hours." Jake raised an eyebrow. "I'm working," The reply was curt, offering no further explanation. He had no obligation to report his activities to some self-appointed compliance unit. Doing what? The man with the mustache immediately shot back, squinting, trying to peer deeper into the dark sedan. His eyes scanned the interior, lingering on the cold coffee cup and the police radio resting on the passenger seat. You don't look like a gardener or a plumber working for anyone around here. The suspicion was evident in his voice. Jake's patience finally snapped. This farce had gone on long enough. Listen, the man with the mustache continued, his voice becoming noticeably harder and more threatening. He placed a hand on his hip, near where he probably imagined a holster would be. Either you produce your ID and registration, and clearly explain your reason for being here, or we will be forced to issue a citation for violating parking regulations and community security rules. And if you don't cooperate, we will have your vehicle towed immediately. To illustrate his threat, he even pulled a small pink booklet from his shirt pocket, the kind used for cheap receipts or citation slips. Jake stared at the pink booklet, then looked up directly into the man's mirrored sunglasses. You're going to ticket an unmarked police vehicle conducting surveillance? He asked directly, his voice now devoid of any sarcasm, carrying only the cold authority of genuine law enforcement. The man with the mustache faltered for a second at Jake's abrupt change in demeanor, but quickly recovered with a dismissive scoff. Police surveillance? Anyone can say that to get out of trouble. He sneered. If you're really police like you claim, then show us a badge. Show us proof. He crossed his arms in front of his chest, openly defiant, clearly believing he had cornered Jake. Jake let out a deep sigh, shaking his head slightly. He didn't have time for this. His surveillance was completely blown. Instead of reaching into his pocket for his wallet to reveal his badge and credentials, he did something else. He reached down to the center console, where a bank of discrete switches lay hidden from casual view. With a light press, the front grille and the area behind the windshield of the otherwise ordinary sedan suddenly erupted in light. The signature red and blue lights of law enforcement flashed rhythmically, reflecting off the stunned faces of the three HOA men. They instinctively jumped back several steps, the smug confidence on the mustached man's face vanishing like a soap bubble, replaced by confusion and fear. Simultaneously, Jake picked up the police radio from the passenger seat and keyed the microphone. Carter, respond to my location. His voice came through the radio clearly, loud enough for the three men to hear. Code 10 to 32. He paused, then added with a touch of dry humor. Negative, disregard. Just, roll on over here, deputy. Got a little community compliance issue needs sorting out. Silence hung heavy for a few short minutes, broken only by the steady flashing of the emergency lights and the audible gasps of the three men. The man with the mustache had removed his sunglasses, revealing wide, anxious eyes. The tall, lanky one swallowed repeatedly, while the round-faced one stared intently at the ground as if searching for a hole to disappear into. Before long, the familiar sound of an approaching siren grew louder. An official patrol car, fully marked with department logos and roof lights, turned onto the street and quickly pulled up, stopping directly behind the beige golf cart. Deputy Carter, a young but experienced and trusted subordinate of Jake's, stepped out of the car, one hand resting casually on his duty belt. He squinted at the scene before him, his boss's unmarked car flashing red and blue, three men in strange uniforms frozen beside a golf cart, and his boss standing there looking distinctly displeased. Sheriff? Carter asked, raising an inquisitive eyebrow. Everything all right? Thought we were watching that house. He discreetly nodded towards the target house across the street. Jake switched off his vehicle's emergency lights, the flashing ceased, restoring a relative quiet to the street. He stepped fully out of the car, adjusting the lapels of his jacket out of habit. Everything was all right, Carter, he said, his voice tinged with weariness. Until this elite HOA compliance unit decided my department vehicle was a national security threat and tried to ticket me for doing my job in their sacred territory. Carter turned to scrutinize the three men, his gaze sweeping over the cheap uniforms and landing on the shiny but fake-looking badge pinned to the mustached man's chest. A suppressed smile played on his lips. HOA compliance unit? He asked again, his voice dripping with disbelief. Seriously? He stepped closer to the mustached man and, without asking permission, deftly plucked the badge from his shirt. He turned it over in his hand, examining the clumsy engraving. Where was this made? The weekend flea market? The mustached man paled, stammering a protest. We are officers authorized by the Homeowners Association. Authorized by who? Carter cut in sharply. The HOA president playing cop gave you permission to run around? Let me see your state security licenses. The PIL be kind. All three men fell silent, exchanging worried glances. None seemed inclined to produce any paperwork. At this point, Jake crossed his arms and stepped closer. Let me make the situation perfectly clear for you gentlemen, he said, his voice low and steel-edged, all humor gone. First, you are impersonating law enforcement officers. That's a felony. Second, you have intentionally obstructed an ongoing criminal investigation by the sheriff's department. Also a felony. Third, you attempted to issue a citation to and have towed an official, on-duty sheriff's department vehicle. Do you have any idea how much serious trouble you are in right now? The complexions of the three men shifted from pale to sheet white. Beads of sweat began to form on the mustached man's forehead. We didn't know. The tall, lanky one stammered, his voice trembling. We were just doing what we were told. Told by who? Jake pressed, his gaze sharp as a razor. By the HOA board. The mustached man admitted quietly, his eyes darting around as if seeking an escape route. They told us we had to patrol, maintain security and order, cite people who violate the rules. Carter, Jake ordered, his eyes fixed on the three suspects. Check their golf cart thoroughly, see if there's anything interesting. Carter nodded and walked over to the golf cart. He opened a large canvas bag attached to its side. Inside was an unsurprising yet still startling sight, a stack of self-printed HOA citation tickets that looked like memo pads, a ledger book meticulously recording names, addresses, violations, and the amount of fines collected, and most tellingly, a small tin box filled with cash, crumpled bills and loose change. Well, Carter whistled softly, picking up the ledger book to flip through it. Looks more like a shakedown operation than community watch, Sheriff. He read a few entries aloud. They've been finding people for every damn thing under the sun. Grass too long by 3 inches, trash cans out at the wrong time, fence paint not the approved shade, and my personal favorite, suspicious unidentified vehicle. Jake turned back to face the mustached man, who now seemed to physically shrink. You actually collect cash from residents for these so-called violations? The mustached man swallowed hard, attempting a weak defense. It's a community compliance fee. No, Jake interrupted flatly. It's called fraud. He turned to Carter, his voice resonating with authority. Deputy, take all three into custody immediately for impersonating law enforcement and obstruction of justice. We'll look into fraud charges and others after a more thorough investigation. Carter nodded, pulling a gleaming pair of handcuffs from his belt. All right, gentlemen of the HOA compliance unit, he said with unconcealed mockery. Time for you to comply with some actual laws. Turn around, hands behind your backs. The last vestiges of resistance drained from the three men. They meekly turned, allowing Carter to cuff them one by one. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed dryly in the air. By now, several doors and window curtains of the surrounding houses had opened. Curious neighbors, initially drawn by the police lights, were now witnessing the unbelievable scene. The familiar neighborhood security officers, often seen swaggering around in their golf cart, being handcuffed by real police. Jake signaled Carter to escort the three men toward the patrol car. He watched them go for a moment, then turned back to Carter. We are going to have a very interesting conversation with the HOA board after I finish up here. Determination flashed in his eyes. This incident clearly went deeper than three idiots playing cop. And just as predicted, the subsequent meeting at the HOA office was fraught with tension. The board members, led by a well-dressed but pale-faced president, attempted to dismiss the incident as a regrettable misunderstanding, claiming they were merely a bit overzealous in maintaining community standards. Jake remained unmoved. He coldly laid out the evidence of impersonation, the blatant obstruction of a police investigation, and the illegal fine collection scheme they had established. He flatly stated that their overzealousness had crossed serious legal boundaries, and they would face the consequences. He demanded their full cooperation with the investigation and advised them to prepare to reimburse all funds extorted from the residents they had bullied. The atmosphere in the office grew heavy, signaling an impending legal storm for the supposedly powerful board. The investigation into the Homeowners Association's, HOA, shady dealings didn't stop with the arrest of the three self-proclaimed compliance officers. Sheriff Jake Thompson knew they were just pawns, foot soldiers on a larger chessboard. The root of the problem lay with the board, the people who had created and condoned this system of abuse. He tasked Deputy Carter, known for his meticulous nature and knack for unearthing details others missed, with digging deep into the HOA's books and records. Carter immersed himself in the task. He started with the documents recovered from the golf cart, the fine ledger, and the cash box. But that was just the surface. He requested and obtained a search warrant for the HOA office, granting access to their entire financial history, meeting minutes, and computer systems. What he found was worse than even Jake had initially suspected. Sitting in a small, temporarily commandeered office at the station, surrounded by stacks of paper and computer monitors displaying complex spreadsheets, Carter began piecing the puzzle together. He discovered a pattern of suspicious expenditures in the HOA's financial reports. There were vague security fees, ambiguous consulting invoices, and cash advances lacking proper documentation. The frequency and amounts of cash fines recorded in the fake cop's ledger didn't fully align with the funds deposited into the official HOA account. A significant portion seemed to have evaporated along the way. The real breakthrough came when Carter started scrutinizing email exchanges between the HOA president, a man named Howard Sterling, and the three officers. Initially, the emails seemed innocuous, containing only general instructions about maintaining community standards and reporting violations. But by digging deeper into deleted emails and hidden archive folders, Carter found much more candid exchanges. There were emails where Sterling directly instructed the trio to target specific residents who had previously complained about HOA activities or had personal disagreements with him. There were emails discussing the split of cash fines collected, with Sterling demanding a larger share for management costs and risk. Even more damning, Carter uncovered emails and internal memos showing that Sterling had convinced other board members to approve the creation of this compliance unit under the guise of an enhanced neighborhood watch volunteer program. He had used the HOA's budget, funded by the very residents he was now oppressing, to purchase the cheap uniforms, the golf cart, and even the fake badges. Direct payments from the HOA account to the personal accounts of the three men, disguised as patrol stipends or expense reimbursements, further cemented the evidence of an organized conspiracy. Sterling hadn't just directed the shakedown, he was blatantly embezzling funds to finance it and enrich himself. Carter compiled all the evidence: printed emails, highlighted bank statements, sworn affidavits from the three officers who had now decided to cooperate in hopes of leniency. The picture was clear. This wasn't the overzealousness of a few volunteers but a deliberate scheme of fraud and embezzlement, orchestrated and run by the head of the HOA himself, with the complicity or willful ignorance of at least a few other board members. He immediately reported his findings to Jake. As Carter detailed the irrefutable evidence, Jake's face hardened. A quiet anger simmered within him, not just at the blatant abuse of power, but at the betrayal of the community's trust by those elected to serve them. He contacted the district attorney's office without delay. After a preliminary review of the evidence Carter had gathered, the DA's response was swift and decisive. They had sufficient grounds to prosecute Howard Sterling and any board members with proven complicity on serious charges, including organized fraud, embezzlement, criminal conspiracy, and impersonating law enforcement, through directing and funding the fake cops. Arrest warrants were approved immediately. The time for action had come. Jake assembled a small team consisting of Carter and two other deputies. He briefly outlined the situation, emphasizing the sensitive nature of the case and the need for swift, professional action. He didn't want the arrests to become a circus, but he also knew that justice needed to be served publicly to begin restoring the community's faith. They arrived at the HOA office mid-afternoon. It appeared the board was holding an unscheduled meeting, likely to deal with the fallout from the earlier arrests of the three officers and the rumors spreading rapidly through the neighborhood. As Jake and the deputies stepped into the conference room, an abrupt silence fell. Howard Sterling, seated at the head of the table looking tense but attempting to maintain control, shot to his feet. The other board members turned, their expressions shifting from surprise to dawning fear as they realized the purpose of this uninvited visit. "Sheriff Thompson," Sterling began, his voice attempting composure. "I assume there's some misunderstanding. We were just—" "There's no misunderstanding, Mr. Sterling," Jake interrupted, his voice cold and final. He signaled the deputies forward. "Howard Sterling, you are under arrest for organized fraud, embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy." He then turned to two other board members seated near Sterling, against whom evidence indicated direct involvement in approving illegal expenditures and knowledge of the compliance unit's true nature. Ms. Miller, Mr. Chin, you are also under arrest for complicity and organized fraud. Carter and another deputy moved forward, reading Miranda rights to each individual, while the third deputy produced handcuffs. Sterling began to protest vehemently. You can't do this! I'm the HOA president. I have rights. I'll call my lawyer. You have every right to call a lawyer after we complete processing downtown, Jake replied, unmoved. The sharp click of handcuffs echoed in the stunned silence of the room as Sterling, Miller, and Chin were secured, hands behind their backs. Their usual air of arrogant authority had completely vanished, replaced by shock and fear. The remaining board members sat frozen in their seats, their faces ashen. As Jake and the deputies escorted the three arrested individuals out of the office, they noticed a small crowd had gathered outside. News of the police presence and the arrests had apparently spread like wildfire. Unlike the initial curiosity when the three fake cops were arrested, the atmosphere in the crowd this time was different. There were whispers, less hesitant pointing, and even quiet but distinctly satisfied applause as Sterling and his accomplices were led to the waiting patrol cars. A few residents, undoubtedly victims of the absurd fines and HOA arrogance, watched with a mixture of anger and profound relief. Justice, however delayed, was finally being served before their eyes. A patrol car's siren chirped briefly before it rolled away, carrying the figures who had once wielded absolute power in this small community. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but an air of excitement and fervent discussion lingered around the HOA office. The climax of the scandal had passed, and now, the road toward healing and rebuilding community trust had truly begun. As the last patrol cars carrying Howard Sterling and his accomplices disappeared down the street, an unusual silence fell over the neighborhood. But this time, it wasn't the tense silence of fear or uncertainty. It was the quiet that follows a storm, a palpable sense of relief spreading through the afternoon air. The neighbors who had gathered outside the HOA office, initially just curious onlookers, began to look at each other, hesitant smiles appearing on their faces. A collective sigh seemed to ripple through the group, breaking the stillness. Then the conversation started, first in hushed tones, then growing into lively discussions right there on the sidewalks and lawns. Stories that people had previously only dared to share behind closed doors were now being told openly. Mrs. Henderson, an elderly widow living on the corner, recounted being fined $150 because her recycling bin was 2 inches off its designated spot on collection day. Mr. Patel, whose garden was always meticulously kept, shook his head in exasperation, recalling the final warning he received for a climbing rose bush deemed aesthetically non-compliant, accompanied by a threat of a hefty fine if he didn't prune it within 48 hours. A young couple shared how they were cited because their daughter's bright blue swing set was considered not harmonious with the community's approved color palette. The stories poured out, each person sharing their own experiences of arrogance, absurd fines, and the condescending attitude of the HOA compliance unit. There was anger in their voices, but now it was mixed with a sense of release and newfound solidarity. They were no longer alone in their frustration. Laughter began to mingle with the complaints, especially when the topic turned to the event that had kicked off the entire chain of events. I still can't believe it, one man said, shaking his head and laughing. Of all the cars in this neighborhood, they had to pick the sheriff's car to mess with. And while he was on duty, no less, a woman added, her voice filled with amazement. Talk about having no fear. Or just being too stupid to realize. The irony of the situation became a recurring theme, a humorous focal point in what had been a deeply annoying saga. The image of the 3 pompous HOA cops confronting the unmarked sedan, blissfully unaware they were challenging the head of the county's law enforcement, was now an anecdote retold with relish. It was proof of the sheer absurdity of the system they had just escaped. Amidst this, Sheriff Jake Thompson, having ensured the final arrests were securely underway, walked back towards the gathered crowd. He didn't need to raise his voice to get their attention. His presence carried enough weight. He approached them, his expression still serious but his eyes somewhat softened. I know what's been happening here lately has caused a lot of trouble and frustration for everyone. Jake began, his voice clear and steady, easily carrying to those nearby. I want to assure you that we are taking this matter very seriously. Those responsible for this abuse of power and fraud will face the law. He paused, surveying the crowd. Regarding the Homeowners Association itself, major changes are obviously needed. We will work with the relevant agencies and the remaining members of the board, those not implicated, to ensure a more transparent and fair management system is established. There will be no more room for this kind of bullying and illegal collection of fines." A murmur of approval went through the crowd. Jake held up a hand for quiet. "For those of you who paid unreasonable fines to this group," he continued, "please hold on to any receipts or proof of payment you may have. The district attorney's office will need that information. We will do our utmost to ensure justice is served and damages are addressed, although that process may take some time." His reassurance seemed effective. Tense faces relaxed, and nods of agreement were visible throughout the group. Jake started to turn away, then paused as if remembering something. He turned to Deputy Carter, who was standing nearby, and spoke quietly, just loud enough for a few close bystanders to overhear, yet still discreetly informative. "By the way, Carter, our presence here today, despite the unexpected interruption, also helped with the original case I was watching at that house. Seems the sudden attention flushed out some suspicious individuals. We'll keep a close eye on that." It was a subtle reminder that amidst all the HOA chaos, real police work continued. It also neatly tied the day's unexpected turn of events back to his original reason for being there, lending a sense of completion to the strange day's work. Later, as Jake and Carter drove away from the now quieting neighborhood in the patrol car, Carter shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and amusement on his face. He glanced at Jake, who was sitting in the passenger seat, gazing straight ahead, seemingly lost in thought. "I still can't believe it, Sheriff," Carter blurted out. "I just can't wrap my head around it. Those guys actually tried to ticket you, the sheriff, while you were sitting in an unmarked car surveilling a felony case. That's truly the height of stupidity, the very definition of shooting yourself in the foot." He chuckled softly. "I bet no HOA security training course covers how to identify and avoid confronting the sheriff during covert operations." Jake allowed himself a small smile, faint and tinged with weariness, but also satisfaction. He turned to look at Carter. "It is hard to believe," he agreed. "But sometimes justice works in strange ways, Carter. We came here for one reason and ended up stumbling onto a completely different problem, one that's been quietly infuriating this whole community for a long time." He leaned back against the seat, watching the scenery pass by the window. "All things considered," he continued thoughtfully, "it wasn't exactly a waste of time. At least we managed to tackle two problems at once. An organized fraud ring exposed, a community freed from oppression, and our original case got a new lead. Maybe it's the universe balancing things out. Or maybe we just got incredibly, bizarrely lucky today." After a moment of silence, he added with a note of dry humor, "And I'll definitely have an interesting story for the briefing next week." In the weeks following the HOA scandal, a new, more genuine peace settled over the neighborhood. Gone were the bossy golf cart patrols and the absurd violation notices tucked under windshield wipers. The Homeowners Association, now under close scrutiny and with carefully elected new members, began operating with transparency and accountability. Meetings became open forums, regulations were reviewed reasonably, and above all, residents felt their voices were heard and respected once more. Their sense of safety was no longer threatened by self-appointed bullies. Sheriff Jake Thompson, the unwitting catalyst for this significant change while simply doing his job, became something of a local legend. The story of his confrontation with the fake HOA cops was retold with admiration. One afternoon, while checking on the neighborhood's progress, an elderly man approached him, shook his hand firmly, and said, "Sheriff, after all this, you ought to think about running for mayor." Jake just offered a gentle smile. "I think I'm better suited for this law enforcement work," he replied. "Right now, the most important thing is ensuring this neighborhood stays truly peaceful." He gave a nod, then turned back to his daily duties, leaving behind a community slowly healing, finally free from the shadow of petty tyranny and the abuse of power. So that was the professional HOA takedown, courtesy of Sheriff Jake Thompson. You see, sometimes justice requires handcuffs and the full force of the law. But what happens when the one facing off against the HOA isn't the sheriff, but just a regular guy wanting some peace and quiet? And what if his only weapon is, well, a bit fragrant? Don't go anywhere, because coming up next is a completely different kind of HOA battle, where the potent smell of fish emulsion becomes the ultimate weapon against the classic neighborhood Karen and her luxury SUV. Trust me, you do not want to miss this hilariously aromatic revenge story. The smell hit me the instant I opened the front door, a pungent, rank odor, like an entire fishing fleet had decided to dump its waste right on my lawn under the sweltering summer sun. But the worst part. The source of that horrific stench was wafting up from directly beneath Karen's pearl-white luxury SUV, parked smack dab on the grass strip I own, completely blocking my driveway. And Karen? She was standing across the street, hands on her hips, her face flush red with anger and, presumably, from the olfactory assault. Believe me, just a few weeks prior, I was just a regular guy wanting quiet weekends to mow the lawn and maybe throw some steaks on the grill. But quiet isn't a word in this neighborhood's vocabulary since Karen appointed herself president of the Homeowners Association, HOA. She's a walking nightmare, measuring grass height with a ruler, sending warning letters for unsuitable window curtain colors, and convinced that the small grass strip between the sidewalk and my driveway was her personal extended parking lot. That strip, I need to emphasize, is listed on my property deed. I'd put up with her petty antics before, but I never imagined it would escalate into literal chemical warfare. The war began on a Monday morning, a morning that should have been ordinary. Early week sunlight streamed through the window, promising a productive workday. I had just brewed my favorite coffee, its rich aroma filling the kitchen, mentally preparing for the meetings and deadlines ahead. Grabbing my briefcase and car keys, I stepped out the front door, planning for a smooth start to the week. But then, all plans evaporated in an instant. I froze on the top step, nearly dropping my coffee. Right before my eyes, completely blocking the entrance to my driveway, was a massive, gleaming, defiant object, Karen's huge luxury SUV. It wasn't parked on the street, nor legally on the curb. No, it was sitting squarely on the green grass strip between the sidewalk and my driveway, the strip I'd painstakingly tended to and carefully trimmed just last weekend. Now, the wide tire tracks of the expensive German vehicle were ruthlessly crushing the tender grass, leaving a clear mark of blatant trespass. More importantly than the ruined grass, the vehicle was completely blocking my exit. There was no way I could get my car out of the garage. This couldn't be a mistake, not a hurried parking job. The placement was too precise, too deliberate. And to dispel any doubt about her intentions, Karen herself was standing right there, next to her vehicle, on the sidewalk. She had her arms crossed, her head tilted slightly up, and that familiar smug smile plastered on her face, the smile she always wore when she was about to inflict some annoyance, or enforce some absurd rule of the HOA she presided over. Her gaze met mine without a hint of apology, only challenge and self-appointed authority. A slow burn of anger started deep in my chest. I took a deep breath, trying hard to suppress the boiling frustration. Past dealings with Karen had taught me that losing my temper only gave her satisfaction and more ammunition to make things difficult. I needed to stay calm, at least outwardly. I walked down the steps, towards her, striving to keep my voice even and as polite as possible, even though inside I was screaming. "Good morning, Karen," I said, my voice tight despite my efforts. I stopped a few feet away from her, my eyes flicking from the car to her. "Your vehicle is parked on my property and completely blocking my driveway." I emphasized the phrase, "my property," hoping the obvious truth might register. Karen raised an eyebrow, the smug smile seemingly widening. She glanced dismissively at the grass strip as if noticing it for the first time. "Oh, this strip?" she said with unbelievable nonchalance, as if the presence of a giant vehicle on someone else's land was perfectly normal. "This is HOA common area, buddy." The blatant lie stunned me. Common area? My property deed clearly outlined the boundaries, and this strip was entirely within my property lines, not communal association land. She knew that she had to. She continued, giving me no chance to refute her lie. "And I'm performing my duties, supervising to see if your driveway complies with the HOA's maintenance and aesthetic regulations." She made air quotes around the word supervising, as if doing me a favor. "It looks like it might need a closer inspection." Her eyes scanned my perfectly normal concrete driveway, searching for some non-existent flaw. My patience started to wear thin. My voice grew firmer, though I still tried to keep the volume down. "This is my property, Karen. Not common area. My deed clearly states the boundaries. You can check if you want. And you have no right to park here, on my private property, especially when it's obstructing my access." I could feel a vein starting to throb in my temple. The audacity was incredible. Karen let out a short, sharp scoff, completely ignoring my assertion of ownership. She spoke smoothly, as if my words carried no weight. "HOA rules permit board members, especially the president, The right to inspect any area within the community to ensure compliance, buddy. She patted the roof of her SUV lightly, a gesture full of confidence and defiance. And to ensure the inspection is thorough and unobstructed, I find it necessary to park here. The absurdity of her explanation almost made me laugh out loud in anger. Parking to block someone's driveway in order to inspect it? What kind of logic was that? But I knew logic wasn't Karen's concern. Power and control were her goals. Until I complete my inspection, she continued, her tone becoming slightly sharper, carrying an unmistakable warning. My vehicle will remain here, and I advise you to think carefully before attempting to move it. Any attempt to tow or damage my property will be considered harassment, and a serious violation of HOA rules. You certainly don't want more trouble with the board, do you? The final threat hung in the morning air. She had set the perfect trap, using her HOA authority as a shield for personal trespassing, painting me as the wrongdoer if I tried to assert my own rights. I stared at her, then at the car blocking my path, a wave of helplessness and fury washing over me. I was late for work. More importantly, I was being bullied by a tyrant on my own property, and she was using the very rules meant to protect the community to do it. The war had truly begun, not with gunfire or a formal declaration, but with a misplaced SUV and an unbearable, smug smile. The following days passed in an atmosphere thick with tension and suffocating helplessness. I knew arguing directly with Karen was pointless. She thrived on confrontations like that. They only fueled her and gave her more excuses to punish. Call the homeowners association HOA? That was tantamount to calling her directly, as she held the power firmly in her grasp, and the other board members were either her lackeys or too intimidated to speak out against her. I tried calling a few local tow companies, explaining the situation, even offering to pay extra. But as soon as they heard HOA and Karen, they all politely declined, mumbling about vague community agreements, or simply not wanting to get involved. Clearly, the influence and fear Karen spread extended beyond the borders of our neighborhood. So, every morning when I woke up, the first thing I saw through my bedroom window was the massive, pearly white silhouette of that luxury SUV, parked defiantly on my poor grass strip. It stood like a living monument to Karen's arrogance and self-granted authority, a constant reminder of my own helplessness. Having to find parking on the street, several houses away, and then walk back while my own driveway was illegally occupied was a daily humiliation. I had to adjust my schedule, leaving home earlier to allow time for the walk to my car, and the frustration built steadily like a ticking time bomb. Karen, of course, seemed to relish every moment. She strutted around, occasionally glancing towards my house with a smug half-smile, as if she had won some great victory. But occupying my driveway was just the opening act of Karen's campaign of terror. A few days later, official letters from the HOA started appearing in my mailbox. Not one, but several letters, each containing a fine more absurd than the last. First came a fine for improper maintenance of the grass strip. The irony was infuriating. Her damn car was crushing and killing the tender grass daily, turning it into a muddy patch whenever it rained, yet I was the one being fined for its lack of upkeep. Next was a fine for obstructing HOA activities. What activities? The activity of parking illegally on someone else's property? Or the activity of supervising my driveway from an unlawful position? Karen's logic was truly warped beyond belief. Each letter came with a hefty fine amount and threats of more severe penalties if not paid promptly. The financial pressure began to mount, but the outrage was far greater. I couldn't take it anymore. The anger and the feeling of being backed into a corner forged a steely resolve. If I couldn't use force or conventional reason, I had to find another way. I couldn't tow her car, couldn't immediately build a fence, but I could do something to the very land she was trespassing on. And then, an idea sparked, mischievous, yet seemingly perfectly legal. If Karen wanted to turn my grass strip into her private parking space, I would turn it into a place where no one, not even someone as brazen as her, would want to park for a single minute. I would use smell. An olfactory assault. The idea of gardening came to mind. Fertilizer. It was a perfectly normal and encouraged activity. But what kind of fertilizer was both effective for plants and capable of repelling uninvited guests? The answer came almost immediately: fish emulsion. I remembered reading about it on gardening forums. An organic fertilizer incredibly beneficial for plants, rich in nitrogen and micronutrients. But it was also famous for another characteristic: its smell. An odor described as extremely pungent, rank, like old, rotting fish. Perfect. But before taking action, I needed to ensure my plan was legally bulletproof. I didn't want to give Karen any excuse to find me further. I spent an entire evening poring over local ordinances regarding fertilizer use and the HOA's detailed landscaping rules. Fortunately, there wasn't a single line prohibiting the use of organic fertilizers, even strong-smelling ones, on private property. As long as I didn't let it run off onto neighboring properties or contaminate public water sources, impossible with such a small strip, I was fully within my rights to use fish emulsion. It was 100% legal. My heart filled with hope. The next day, I drove to the largest garden supply store in town. I selected the most concentrated kind of fish emulsion available, the extra strength type that promised maximum effectiveness, both in nutrients and aroma. I bought several large bottles, enough to turn the grass strip into a promised land of unpleasantness. All that remained was to wait for the perfect opportunity, a hot, sunny day, when the sun could maximally amplify the special aroma. And then that day arrived. The weather forecast promised scorching sun and high temperatures. Early the next morning, before the sun was fully up and certainly before Karen could make her usual parking maneuver, I took action. Donning the thickest rubber gloves I owned and an N95 mask, though I knew it could hardly block out this particular smell, I opened the first bottle of fish emulsion. An immediate blast of rank, pungent air assaulted my nostrils, stronger and fouler than I had imagined. The thick, sludgy brown liquid itself didn't look very appealing either. Fighting back nausea, I carefully diluted it according to the instructions, perhaps a little less diluted than recommended, and began to drench the grass strip. I didn't just water it. I practically soaked it in the horrific concoction, focusing especially on the areas where Karen's tires usually rested. The stench quickly permeated the still morning air, a smell of oceanic death and organic decay. Finished, I quickly cleaned up my tools, disposed of the gloves and mask in a sealed trash bag, and retreated inside, holding my breath and waiting. Right on schedule, around 7-something in the morning, the familiar pearly white SUV rounded the corner. Karen drove with her usual confidence, unsuspecting, maneuvering gently to mount the curb and park precisely in her favorite spot, on my grass strip. She turned off the engine, probably preparing to step out with a triumphant smirk. But the moment she opened the car door, everything changed. I watched from my window, clearly seeing her expression shift. First surprise, then quickly morphing into disgust and disbelief. The rank odor, already baking in the morning sun, wafted up from the damp earth as an invisible but incredibly potent vapor, seeping directly into the luxury SUV's cabin. She coughed violently, slamming the door shut, but it was too late. The smell had already invaded. By noon, under the harsh summer sun, I was sure that horrific stench would deeply permeate the expensive leather upholstery, the floor mats, the air conditioning system, a persistent reminder of her unwanted presence. It didn't take long. A few minutes later, Karen stormed out of the car, her face flushed with anger and perhaps lack of oxygen. She didn't bother knocking, she practically pounded on my door. I calmly went to open it, maintaining the most innocent expression I could muster. "What the hell did you do to that lawn?" she shrieked, her voice cutting through the morning birdsong. She had to stand back a bit, clearly unable to tolerate the aroma emanating from the very grass strip she had just violated. "The smell is horrible. Are you trying to poison the neighborhood?" I shrugged, casually holding up the remaining bottle of fish emulsion. "Oh, good morning, Karen. Just fertilizing the lawn. Using premium organic stuff, good for the environment. Landscaping, you know. I remember the HOA rules strongly encourage that, right?" I smiled sweetly. "Looks like your car is parked right on my valuable fertilizer, though. Hope it doesn't damage the tires or anything." Karen was speechless. She stared at the fertilizer bottle in my hand, then back at the dark, damp, reeking grass strip. The anger on her face slowly morphed into confusion and helplessness. She knew I had played by the rules. She couldn't find me for gardening on my own property with a perfectly legal product. She could try calling the HOA to complain about an unpleasant odor, but it was just fertilizer smell, albeit a bit stronger than usual. Who could forbid someone from fertilizing their plants? She could get her car washed, detailed, deodorized, but as long as she parked there again, the smell from the ground would continue to assault her precious vehicle. The only remaining choice for Karen was clear: either continue to endure the vile stench embedding itself into her expensive SUV, or find somewhere else to park. For the first time since this battle began, I saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. And I knew my legal stink bomb plan had achieved initial success. The next few days were an odor-filled test of endurance for Karen. She clearly tried to act unaffected, still stubbornly parking her luxury SUV on my grass strip each morning, as if to prove that a little unpleasant smell couldn't sway her iron will. But the signs of discomfort became increasingly obvious. She got out of her car faster, almost lunging out, and slammed the door shut immediately, instead of lingering to supervise, as before. Occasionally, I'd catch her grimacing when a light breeze blew, carrying the characteristic aroma of fish emulsion baking in the summer sun. Her once gleaming vehicle now seemed to constantly carry a faint, indescribable odor, despite the fact she likely spent a small fortune on professional car washes and deodorizing services. That rank, persistent smell wasn't just an olfactory nuisance. It became a form of psychological torture, a constant reminder of the defiance she faced from a seemingly powerless neighbor. Under the harsh summer sun, that small patch of grass had turned into a biological reactor, relentlessly emitting an invisible but highly effective weapon. I could see Karen's patience eroding day by day. The usual smug smile on her lips was now often mixed with scowls and annoyance. The look in her eyes when we accidentally crossed paths on the street no longer held the condescension of before, but flickered with malice and resentment. She knew she was losing this olfactory war, and she wasn't accustomed to that feeling. Someone who always needed to be in control like Karen must have felt helpless and enraged at being defeated by such a simple, yet profoundly annoying, tactic. I knew she wouldn't give up easily. Someone like Karen, when backed into a corner, often resorts to reckless and desperate actions. And then, on a muggy, moonless night, her last shred of patience finally snapped. Darkness settled over the quiet neighborhood, leaving only the chirping of insects and the pale yellow glow of streetlights. I had gone to bed, but a vague sense of unease kept me occasionally checking the security camera feed linked to my phone. And then, around 2 a.m., the screen suddenly showed movement in the area of the front grass strip. My heart hammered against my ribs. Under the camera's dim infrared light, a figure was moving stealthily. It was unmistakably Karen. She was dressed head to toe in dark clothing, trying to blend into the shadows like some clumsy, low-budget ninja. She moved cautiously, her eyes constantly darting around, clearly afraid of being detected. In her hand was a large plastic jug, the kind often used for chemicals. She went straight to my stink bomb grass strip, where her SUV was no longer parked. She must have reluctantly found another spot after days of suffering. She opened the jug's cap and began pouring the liquid inside onto the grass. Though the camera image wasn't perfectly clear, I could guess it was strong bleach or a potent weed killer, based on how carefully she avoided getting it on her hands and the way the liquid seemed to fizz slightly upon contact with the damp earth still reeking of fish emulsion. Her purpose was painfully obvious: to eradicate the source of the horrible smell that had tormented her, or perhaps just killed the grass entirely, turning it into a dead, barren patch as revenge. A blatant, desperate act of vandalism. A cold sense of satisfaction mixed with tension rose within me. She didn't know I had anticipated this move. I had upgraded my security camera system shortly after the conflict began, ensuring every angle around my house was closely monitored, especially the disputed grass strip. This footage was irrefutable proof. Without a moment's hesitation, I picked up my phone and dialed 911. My voice remained steady but conveyed urgency as I reported someone actively vandalizing my property with hazardous chemicals, stating I had clear video evidence. While waiting for the police, I kept my eyes glued to the phone screen, tracking Karen's every move. She was still engrossed in pouring the toxic chemicals, completely unaware that her illegal actions were being recorded and her fate was about to be sealed. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing steadily closer, tearing through the night's silence. Flashing blue and red lights began to reflect off the surrounding houses, becoming brighter and brighter. Karen jumped startled at the sound of the sirens. She looked around frantically, trying to hide the jug, but it was too late. 2 police cruisers pulled up right in front of my house. Officers quickly emerged, flashlights scanning the area. A powerful beam landed directly on Karen's face, now pale with shock and fear. She froze mid-motion on the grass strip, the plastic jug still in her hand, the acrid smell of chemicals rising around her, mingling horribly with the lingering fishy stench. "Ma'am, what are you doing out here at this hour?" An officer called out, his voice firm. Karen stammered, trying to regain her usual composure but failing miserably. I was just trying to clean up this horrible smell. It's polluting the whole neighborhood. She attempted to cast herself as the victim, someone performing a public service. But the clumsy lie didn't fool the experienced officers. They saw the chemical jug in her hand, smelled the strong bleach odor, and most importantly, I had quickly stepped outside and showed them the crystal-clear video footage on my phone. The recording captured Karen's entire stealthy act of vandalism. Karen's face went from pale to ashen white as she realized she was caught red-handed, with no way to deny it. All her usual arrogance and authority vanished, replaced only by fear and humiliation. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for trespassing and vandalism," the officer stated plainly, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. "No! You can't do this! I'm the HOA president! This is a misunderstanding!" Karen started shouting, struggling weakly as the cold metal cuffs snapped around her wrists. But all protests were futile. The evidence was overwhelming, her actions blatant. Dawn broke after the dramatic night, bringing not just light but also a wave of news that spread like wildfire throughout the neighborhood. The story of Karen, the unchallenged queen of the HOA, being handcuffed and led away by police in the dead of night for vandalism became the hottest topic of discussion. It was like a bomb that shattered the long-standing false tranquility. Phones rang off the hook, hushed conversations took place over fences, neighborhood group chats exploded with shocked emojis and endless speculation. This time, it wasn't vague rumors or backfence complaints. Karen's actions were too blatant, the video evidence too clear, and the police involvement undeniable. The veil of power and invincibility she had painstakingly constructed crumbled to dust after one foolish night involving a bottle of chemicals and a stinky patch of grass. The fearful silence Karen once commanded gave way to a palpable excitement, an indescribable sense of liberation. Neighbors who had previously gritted their teeth and endured absurd rules and unjust fines now felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted. Some openly expressed their satisfaction, others shook their heads in pity at the downfall of someone once so powerful. But everyone agreed that this was inevitable. Karen's tyranny had gone too far, and the act of vandalism was merely the final straw. The HOA board, which had largely operated under Karen's shadow, now had no choice but to take decisive action. The incident was too public, too scandalous. Having their president arrested for a criminal offense within the neighborhood was an intolerable stain. Less than 24 hours after the arrest, an emergency board meeting was urgently convened. The atmosphere in the meeting room was entirely different from usual. Gone was the tense deference, the robotic nods of agreement to Karen's whims. Instead, there was seriousness, determination, and perhaps a touch of relief. Members who had previously remained silent out of fear now dared to speak up, voicing long-suppressed grievances. The vote was swift and nearly unanimous. Karen was ousted from the presidency and completely removed from all positions on the HOA board, effective immediately. It was a rapid and total collapse, marking the definitive end of her autocratic reign. But the consequences of Karen's actions didn't stop there. The arrest for vandalism inadvertently opened Pandora's box, revealing her other secrets. The police involvement, coupled with the outrage among HOA members, raised serious questions about the association's management and finances under Karen's tenure. Some members of the newly emboldened board proposed a full audit of the HOA's financial activities over the past few years, something previously unthinkable. The audit was quickly conducted by an independent firm. And what they uncovered was even more shocking than the late-night vandalism. It turned out Karen hadn't just abused her power to bully neighbors and impose petty rules. She had also embezzled a significant amount of money from the HOA funds over several years. Personal bills disguised as operational expenses, questionable expenditures for dubious business trips, even signs of funds being transferred to personal accounts. The arbitrary fines she had issued were sometimes not fully recorded in the official books. The truth revealed a comprehensive picture of greed and the corrupting influence of power. Karen wasn't just a petty tyrant, she was a sophisticated fraudster, exploiting her position for personal gain at the expense of the entire community. Facing criminal charges for vandalism, overwhelming public shame, and now the potential of being sued by the HOA itself to recover the embezzled funds, Karen completely crumbled. She had lost all faith in the community. The neighbors' stares were no longer fearful but filled with contempt and ridicule. Former close allies now kept their distance, afraid of being implicated. The large house, once a symbol of her power, now became a prison of her humiliation. Just a few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on Karen's front lawn. The selling process wasn't smooth. News of what had happened spread quickly, and no one wanted to buy the house of a disgraced former HOA president arrested for vandalism and facing embezzlement allegations. Perhaps even the faint, strange smell, lingering around my grass strip, though much faded, contributed to potential buyers' hesitation. Ultimately, Karen was forced to sell the house at a loss, pack her belongings quietly, and disappear from the neighborhood as quickly as she had once dominated it. The day her moving truck rolled away, there were no farewells, no regretful glances, only silence and a sense of relief that enveloped the entire neighborhood. Karen's departure brought profound change to the community. The old HOA board essentially dissolved. Some members resigned out of shame or unwillingness to continue, while others realized the old power structure was completely rotten. A neighborhood referendum was organized. Faced with two choices: completely overhaul the HOA with new leadership, transparent rules, and a more moderate approach, or dissolve the association entirely. The majority of residents, after years under oppressive rule and realizing life was perfectly fine, perhaps even better, without the excessive regulations and control, voted overwhelmingly to dissolve the HOA. No more fine letters for the color of a fence or the height of the grass. No more constant fear of accidentally violating some obscure rule. The atmosphere in the neighborhood became noticeably lighter and friendlier. People seemed more open, more willing to help each other without going through a bureaucratic and tyrannical apparatus. The grass strip in front of my house, the origin of the war and the witness to Karen's downfall, gradually revived. The toxic chemicals were treated, the last traces of fish emulsion finally faded completely, giving way to the vibrant green shoots of new grass pushing strongly towards the sun, like a symbol of the new beginning for the entire neighborhood. Life finally returned to the peaceful rhythm I had longed for. Waking up each morning, I no longer faced the sight of a massive SUV blocking my exit, nor did I dread opening the mailbox for fear of another absurd fine letter. Karen's oppressive presence had completely vanished from my daily life. The most amusing part was the grass strip in front of my house, the former stink bomb battlefield, which was now incredibly lush and green. Perhaps that potent fish emulsion, despite its horrific smell, really was a miracle cure for the lawn. Occasionally, on hot summer days, when a gentle breeze blew just right, I still felt like I could catch the faintest whiff of fishiness, a humorous and deeply satisfying reminder of my unique victory. Neighbors now looked at me with a mixture of amusement and respect. I overheard them jokingly refer to me as the fish emulsion warrior. The nickname made me chuckle, but I also felt a little proud. One beautiful weekend afternoon, as I was relaxing on my porch, my elderly next-door neighbor walked by, stopped, and said with a laugh, "Hey, I gotta admit your method was unique, that's for sure. Who would have thought? But you can't argue with the results." I just shrugged and smiled back. Sometimes, to fight stubborn nuisances, you need a solution that's a little more pungent, sir. As long as it's perfectly legal. The neighborhood had truly changed. The air felt quieter, friendlier. And I could finally, genuinely enjoy those peaceful weekend afternoons, grilling some fragrant steaks in the backyard without a worry in the world.